Welcome to Introduction to Next.js with me, your instructor, Scott Moss, and Front-End Masters. So this course has been highly requested from Front-End Masters, and I feel really honored to be the one to teach it. And it means a lot to me because I have so much love for this framework and I have so much love for this company, Front-End Masters. But as far as when it comes to Next.js, I use it in a lot of ways, whether it's for building out blogs and static websites or even full-blown full-stack applications, even APIs. I also do tons of integration with it at the company that I'm at, and we work closely with the team at Verso, who are the creators of Next.js. So I really love this framework from all angles, and I know there are so many people that are qualified to teach this, so I feel really honored to be the one to deliver this framework to you and just express my love for this framework, as you'll see and hear a lot from me. So let's just get started. Let me bring my mouse back over here. So this course is gonna be a little different normally compared to how I normally do my courses, whereas before I might have like a repo with some tests and some branches, and you go through the test and you get them to pass and then you move on. This one's gonna be more of a follow along type format, but don't worry, no pressure. You're not forced to follow along, you're encouraged. But there are a ton of resources that are going to keep you. So the first thing is this website here. So if you navigate to hendrixer.github.io, which is my GitHub page's URL, my username is Hendrixer after my son Hendrix, and the URL is Next.js course. Fun fact, if you just go to the root, you'll actually see this website, which is the first open source library that I ever made, like 6 years ago when I was learning the code. It was an animation library for Angular, and it ended up getting like 10,000 stars or something like that. And this is actually the open source library that introduced me into the Angular team, into the open source world, and allowed me to speak at conferences and stuff like that. Literally, this is the first thing that I ever made. And I was taken back when I went to this website because I haven't seen it in so long. And the fact that it still runs on like Angular version, I don't know, like 1.2 or something like that, I don't know. It's still pretty impressive. So I was kind of taken back by that. But here we go to the actual course. So yeah, if we go to here, I'll be using this as a reference to everything that we do. So I'll try to stay on topic of what's actually here. And you'll see there's gonna be a lot of things in here to help you stay up to speed as well. There's gonna be tons of things for you to copy and paste and stuff like that. So what we'll do is we'll just jump right in and go into these table of contents, and we'll see all the other resources we need to get started. So I'm just gonna start with this introduction here. Basically, so this course is gonna be an introduction to Next.js, and we're gonna talk about all the things we're gonna cover, but we won't be going into really advanced things, at least not consistently. I will be talking about advanced things because I just can't help it, but the curriculum isn't designed to go that deep. This is gonna be a really nice introduction from my perspective on how I think someone would benefit from learning Next.js. And of course, there's other guides and tutorials and even their documentation. And Next.js's website is actually really good. They have like this follow along thing where you get like points and scores for going through the documentation, and you get a quiz and stuff like that. It's actually really good. So there are tons of really good resources out there. This is just my twist on it, my flavor. So who are you? Basically, you know some React. If you know some React, then this course is perfect for you. But it's also perfect for anyone who maybe doesn't really know React, but they do know web development. Maybe they've come from another framework. I think you're gonna be fine here. I'm doing my best to stay on topic with Next.js specifics and not so much of the things that are required by Next.js, which is React. So I won't be talking too much about React in general. I'll just be focusing on the Next.js stuff. If you want to learn React, Front-End Masters has tons of courses on React. I think Brian Holt actually just taught one recently, so you can check out his. I want to say it's V5, intro V5, if I'm correct, Mark. Is it V5? Yeah. So check that one out. It's really good. There's tons of others on there as well. But if you are a React pro and you're just like, yeah, I've been doing React forever, I'm on the React core team. Okay, this course is still for you as well, because again, this is just my spin, my perspective on what Next.js is. And I have no doubt that you can read documentation and go from there. This is just how I feel this is how I would have liked to learn Next.js. And I just wanted to share, my path towards that. And this course is also going to cover a decent amount of Jamstack practices. And the reason I put this here is a lot of people ask me, it's like, well, Jamstack, what about Jamstack? And I think I just want to talk a little bit about that because, I mean, as you'll see, the company that I'm at actually just is Jamstack. I mean, it's literally all we do. So I feel like I know a lot about that, and that's pretty much all I do every day. And how to use Jamstack with Next.js might not be obvious, although new things are coming out that make it obvious. So I'll talk a little bit about that too, but that stuff is also kind of advanced right now, but we'll get into it. And a lot of the learnings that you'll see, like I said, are specific to Next.js, but there are also some very generic things that you can carry along to other frameworks as well. So what can you expect? The class's goal is basically to walk away with the ability to create an app using Next.js and have a great foundation to learn more advanced topics. That's basically it. So I feel like after you take this course, you should be able to make a Next.js app from start to finish, production ready, because it's actually free with Next.js, and not have to worry about what's going on. And you'll see how in a minute. And a lot of that isn't going to do with the fact that I think my curriculum is good. It's actually because the framework is just that good that it kind of gives you that for free. This is an open source website. So if you see some typos, which I'm famous for typos, but I did use Grammarly this time, so maybe there aren't that many typos. But if you do, you can make a pull request and help me fix them. So thank you. A little bit about myself. This is me trying to go Super Saiyan because I just love Dragon Ball Z. It's like one of my favorite animes. I watch it all the time. My name is Scott Moss. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Type. We are a headless CMS. If you don't know what that is, you can think of WordPress without the page builder. So we let you design a schema, any shape, any form, any way that you want, and we allow you and your team to create content based off that schema. And then we just deliver it to you over an API to any app, any platform, anywhere you want. Anything that has internet connection, we can send content to it. And at the end of the day, that's basically what we are. And we've been doing this for a little over 2 years now. So it's been a blast. Outside of the code, I'm into a lot of things, specifically fitness, especially like basketball. Recently, I picked up hot yoga because I'm not flexible and I'm trying to get flexible. And hot yoga is actually like the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but I love it. So I've been doing a lot of that. I do like calisthenics. I don't really lift weights anymore. So I'm doing like a lot of body weight stuff. I'm also into like building gaming computers. It's kind of like my thing now. Lately, I've been into like building the most powerful computer I can in the smallest form factor without sacrificing things like thermal quality and stuff like that. But I also play games. So if you play first-person shooters like Overwatch, Call of Duty, I always play with people. I even just tweet out sometimes like, yo, who wants to play? And I literally just play with anyone. So like, if you want to go a couple rounds, let me know, down to play. And then if you also know me, you know that I'm really into fashion, specifically like collecting sneakers. I haven't got any lately with the pandemic and stuff because, I mean, I don't even go anywhere. I haven't actually put on real shoes in quite some time. So I still collect sneakers though. I'm still watching, I'm still looking. So, we'll see how that goes. Currently, I'm living in Sacramento, California with my family. And before that, I was living in San Francisco, Oakland, LA, and San Diego. But I'm not from California. I'm originally from Atlanta, but joining the military, the Navy, brought me out to California a little over 10 years ago, and I've been here ever since. So I don't think I'll leave this place. I kind of love it. And yeah, that's basically a lot about me. And a special thanks to Front-End Masters. Like I said, this wouldn't be possible without them. If you've never met the team or interacted with the team of Front-End Masters, I'll just tell you this. They're like the best team out there. It's more than like a partnership. They really are like family to me. I hang out with these folks all the time. We play games together. They help me with all different types of things. It's just really a great environment with them, and it's always fun. So I just feel honored to be part of the team and to be able to offer any type of value like teaching this course. So super thankful, and big thanks to them for getting all this set up. Look at this studio here in my house. So yeah, it's really awesome. Thanks, Front-End Masters. You guys are awesome. And let's head over to the course overview. Also, I realized I forgot to mention, if you prefer like a light theme, if you haven't clicked this yet, you can click that. And you can get like a nice light theme if you prefer it that way. I like to keep things dark, so I'm just gonna go back to my dark theme here. All right, so course format. Basically, in this course, like I said, you're going to be following along with me as I go through these topics in real time. But like I said, there's no pressure for you to keep up with me. Not that I'm going to be going fast, or not that you can't keep up. It's just there's no pressure, because most of the stuff is going to be in this actual curriculum here that you can copy and paste. And if not, we actually do have a repo here at my GitHub. So Hendrixer/Next.js-course-app. You can go there. You can actually go to the repo. And what I've done there is for every major checkpoint, I've made a branch that you can check out to. So for instance, all throughout the lesson, you'll see something like this at the end of a lesson that says, hey, you can check out to this branch and you'll be at the completion of this lesson. So this is what the lesson looks like when you're done. So if you didn't feel like following along, it was too much, or whatever reason, if I'm going too fast, you can always check out to that branch and catch up to where we are, or whenever you would like to. So that's there for you as well. But we will just be starting from scratch. This repo is here as just a reference for you to catch up. And as far as what we're going to be making in this course, because I like to tie in learning something with actually making something, even if it is trivial, I still think it just solidifies some of the topics. We'll be building a SaaS note-taking app, basically. It's very simple, and I kept it simple on purpose because I really want to focus on the Next.js specifics and not have some really complicated feature-heavy application get in the way. I feel like we've all know how to build apps before, so let's just keep it simple and focus on the actual framework. So that's what I'll do. And that's actually my philosophy throughout this whole course, is just try to keep everything else out of the way and focus on the Next.js specifics. So you'll see me glossing over things that are required by Next.js because I don't think it's important to learn Next.js. But obviously, I'm here to answer any questions. If you feel like I'm glossing over something that's important, you can ask a question, and I will be, interacting with you all to ask, hey, do you want me to go back and talk about this a little bit? But I can assure you that you'll get what you need from this course when it comes to Next.js. Here's a little legend that might want to check out, because I'll have like these little asides or these little quotes all throughout the curriculum. So if you see something like this, it's a tip. I'll usually say something like, hey, I recommend using this or doing that, or go check this out. So you'll see this sometimes. A reminder is when I'm just reminding you, like, hey, by the way, remember, this is how this works, so don't forget. Careful, you might see me warn you, is like, don't do this for this reason, or be careful, this might happen. We talked about the lesson branch. Check out to get branch name. A summary is sometimes I'll just have a really long explanation about something, and if you don't feel like reading it, you'll just see a TLDR here. Too long, didn't read. And then extra. Wow, first typo. I just noticed that. And then the next thing you'll see is some extra info here. So sometimes I will deep dive on stuff because I just can't help it, and I think it'll be very helpful. So you'll see me just take off and just deep dive on a topic for a little bit that I think people would like to know about. Let's go into the setup. So what are you going to need to actually do this course? This is it. You really only need Node.js greater than 10. I'm using version 12.8, I believe. So you can go to that version if you like, but I believe anything over 10 should be fine. So you should be good there. I like to use NVM or N to manage my Node versions. So I recommend you do that as well. You can easily switch between them, and you avoid the whole permissions issue when you install Node globally and things like that. And then you also need NPM or Yarn. NPM comes installed with Node, so you should have that already. I'm going to be using Yarn. I don't think Yarn is specifically better than NPM. It's just I switched a long time ago, and now that NPM is better, I just don't feel like switching back. That's it. I think they're both great tools. You can use whichever one you want. But I'm just going to use Yarn here. So that's pretty much what I'll be doing. And that's it. You don't really need anything else for this specific course. So now, what are you going to learn? Yeah, you're going to learn Next.js, but what specifically? Because there's a lot. There's so much into Next.js, and I don't say that to say that it's a complicated framework. It's definitely a complicated framework to make, but because of that, it's easy for us to use. And there was so much that went into me deciding what I wanted to teach in this course, because like I said, I know this framework from so many angles, from integrating with it on lower level primitives to using it, building out static sites. So I kind of know from all angles. So I'm always trying to pick and choose which will be best to talk about. So here's pretty much what I decided to cover in this course. And again, this is not like a strict list of these are only the things I'm going to be talking about, because I'm not. If you know me, I'm going to go off on tangents and just ramble about things that I think would be really cool, and I'll do that. But as far as like the text and the the stuff that you see on this website is mostly going to follow this. So what is Next.js? How does Next.js compare to React? When would you use it? Getting started, creating pages and components, things like SEO, static and dynamic routing, navigating, styling, API routes. Yep, API routes. Fetching data, pre-rendering, deployment, and a little bit of Jamstack stuff. So it's a lot. It's a lot going to be happening, but you're going to see that it's just so delightful to work with Next.js. They make all of this pretty easy. So I'm super excited to just have everyone know how to use it. So any questions on that with the Next.js and what we're going to be learning? Is there something specific that someone was looking forward to learning that I didn't say here?
I think just a lot of people are using Gatsby, it sounds like. So
a lot of people using Gatsby.
You'll get into that later.
Oh yeah, definitely will get into Gatsby, because as much as I use Next.js, I also use a lot of Gatsby, and I work with the Gatsby team on integrations the same way I work with the Next team. So I feel pretty versed in Gatsby as well. In fact, this website is built on Gatsby. So yeah, I can talk about Gatsby as much as you all need me to. What is Next.js? Well, I think in order to understand Next.js, you really got to understand some of its bigger dependencies. And the biggest one I would have to say is obviously going to be React. So all of you might know React, but if you don't, I like to think of React as not a framework. It's actually more of like a view library. If you think of React by itself, if you just npm install React, you can't really build a full, feature-rich application with just React. You're gonna have to install a few more things, a router. You got to figure out how to do styling, and we all know there's 1,000 ways to do CSS and React. You're gonna have to build a build system, unless you get like a CLI or something like that, or some boilerplate. There's just a lot that you have to do, whether it's easy for you to do with a CLI or you do manually. You still have to decide on what approach you're going to do. So you still have to make a lot of decisions, regardless of how easy those decisions are to implement. And that's kind of how React is. So Next.js is what I call like a framework, or like a app-ready framework. Next.js is a full stack framework, as in it not only lets you build front-end applications, but it also helps you build out APIs, which is really interesting. And it uses React as its view library. So when you start actually, putting stuff on the page, you'll be using React, and that's how Next basically uses React. So it's built on top of that. You'll see other frameworks use other libraries like Vue. There's some that use Angular, and even Gatsby is another framework that's built on top of React. They all decided to do that because React is a really good framework. So it seems like a really good idea. But yeah, they're very similar. So that means all the stuff you know about React and all the knowledge that you've gained there, it's going to transfer over to Next.js. So it's not like something completely new and you got to reset how you think. Nope, it's going to be everything going to be carried over. And you're just going to learn some new conventions and new opinions and stuff like that. So talking about those opinions, and that's basically what Next.js is. It's a whole bunch of opinions and conventions built on top of the React framework. And this team has a history of building tons of quality applications. The team at Versal are the creators of Next.js. It used to be called Zeit. They're Versal now. And they created this framework, and they basically just taken all their opinions, all the stuff the community's been doing for years, and just like decided that here's the way that we feel that everyone is going to do it anyway. So we're just going to bake it into this thing, call it a framework, and just give it to you. And it actually just makes sense, because who wants to go set up server-side rendering and CSS modules every single time they make a React app? You probably don't, which is why you reach for some type of boilerplate or something like that, because you just don't want to do it. Well, this is the next level of that. You can think of this as like boilerplate automated or computed, so you can actually work with it, and not boilerplate as in like, oh, it's just React, but it's just a starter reference, but it's really nothing else other than just a starter. So pretty dope framework. So here's some of the highlights that you get for free with Next.js. You get a developer build system, which I don't know these days if people make build systems from scratch anymore, but when I was learning to write code, I had to make Webpack configs from scratch. It's crazy saying it now because I don't think anyone does that. They just don't make dev builds anymore. It's just free now. But yeah, they give you one that's very good and you almost never have to touch. You also get a production one, which is the same. You get pre-rendering, so things like server-side rendering, build time, and then also like static. And we'll talk a lot about those things. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, we're definitely going to get there. You get routing for free, so you don't have to figure out what router to install and how to use it and how to set it up, because we all know the router ecosystem in React is all over the place right now. So if you know what I'm talking about. And then API routes. Yeah, like I said, this is a full stack framework, so you can actually develop APIs in this framework, which is very reminiscent of like back in the day, like when Node first came out and everyone like made single page apps with their Express app, and they did like express.static, and they would just serve the index.html, and they would have like their Angular app, the mean stack. And then we realized that that was a bad idea because, we need CDNs. So it's like that, but they don't live together, and you still have CDNs and all of this flexibility. So you get that same experience of having it co-located, but you get the really good experience of having everything performant, which we didn't have before, unless you threw like Nginx in front of it and all this crazy stuff. But now, no, we get all this stuff for free now. So really dope. Always hear, well, what about Create React App? Doesn't Create React App do, a lot of this stuff? Absolutely. Create React App does do a lot of this stuff, and it also has a lot of opinions baked into it. But Create React App is basically boilerplate, right? It doesn't add any new functionality to React. It basically just takes it takes like a build system, basically the build system. It takes a build system and says, here you go. We gave you a really nice build system, which is actually really good, and we'll manage it for you. And then you can just go ahead and build your app. And that's what you get for free. And then when you start making your app, it's just React. There are no conventions or anything that's baked into Create React App when it comes to actually writing your application. Because it's just regular React at that point. You still have to figure out things like a router and stuff like that. There's still some decisions you have to make. So I would say it's probably the best boilerplate you can do. And even now, sometimes in some cases, I would recommend using Create React App over Next.js. And you'll see in a minute where I think that's true. But no, it's not like Next.js. You don't get server-side rendering and API routes and things like that. So it's not a complete framework. It's just a really good conventions and opinions baked into a build system that you can actually eject and customize if you want to as well. So, and then you're not even inside Create React App anymore at that point. You're just a React app. And then what about Gatsby? So I would say Gatsby is definitely more similar to Next.js than Create React App. Gatsby and Next.js app are actually very similar. I would say Gatsby has like conventions built into it as well, and even stronger conventions, specifically around like how it wants to do data fetching. And it has this thing called like a content mesh where you can pull in data from tons of sources and aggregate them to, a single GraphQL schema. And then that way it's just unified and, type checked and ready to go in your application. And that experience is really nice. But, there's a lot of overhead there. You have to know GraphQL in order to use Gatsby, or at least to get the best from it. You don't have to use GraphQL. You can definitely not use it, but then I think you kind of defeat the point of using Gatsby in the first place. So there's a lot of stuff there. Also, Gatsby doesn't have the ability to create like API routes and stuff like that. It's not a full stack framework, but it does offer a lot of the same stuff as Next.js, like client-side routing, static generation, things like that. And the tooling is really good too. So they're both very similar. And I would also say that Gatsby has like better support when it comes to doing things statically, like sourcing content, like, building documentation, stuff like that. But that also depends on how comfortable you are with GraphQL and things like that. But that's not to say that Next.js doesn't support that stuff, because it does, and their support is getting better. So it really just depends, and we'll talk about that. So yeah, when to use Next.js. So my general guide to when to use Next.js when making a React app, I like to just go through like this little list of different things like that. One tip here though is just never start a React app from scratch. There's just so much out there these days. I just don't understand why anyone would ever just make a React app from scratch. Like, if you think your case is that specific and it's that unique that there's nothing out there that's going to help you have to do it from scratch, you're lying to yourself because that's just not true. Eventually, you're just going to converge. Eventually just going to go look at the source code for Create React App and look at their Webpack config, and you're going to copy it. That's what you're going to do because that's eventually what you're leading to. So learn from the people before you and use these conventions. Just don't create from scratch. Okay, so do you only need a single page app? Then use Create React App. Single page app, as in I'm only doing client-side routing. I don't care about server-side rendering. I don't care about API routes. This is a single page app. It's hidden behind a paywall. That's it. I would say, yeah, you probably should just use Create React App. Although Next.js and Gatsby will work for that as well, they're not built for that. And you have to turn off and opt out of a lot of things to be able for it to be a single page app. Create React App is just a single page app. So just use that. Do you need a static site like a blog that's also a single page application? Use Next.js or Gatsby. And this is going to come down to preference. How comfortable are you with GraphQL? Is there a specific plugin that one of these things has that you really have to take advantage of? Are you sourcing from a CMS or not? And does that CMS have support for this framework? Different things like that. I think that's what it's going to come down to, but both of these work pretty well there. Do you need server-side rendering and API and all the above? Then yeah, you're going to use Next.js because it's the only one that does that. So yeah, those are my opinions on when to use this framework. And pretty much these days, I use Next.js for all my React stuff, except for when it comes to like really heavy static sites. For now, I've been using Gatsby, but even Next.js is figuring out ways to improve, and they have a lot of stuff coming out. I almost never use Create React App because I just don't build single page apps anymore. And or I guess if I'm building a library, I'll just use a library starter, but that's not an app. So yeah.
Databases with Next.js.
All right, somebody asking that question knows Next.js. So yeah, we're gonna get to that. And yes, you can use databases with Next.js because Next.js is a full stack framework. So anything you can do server side, you can pretty much do with Next.js.
There's questions about the microservice versus monolith. Did you mention anything with that?
I didn't mention anything about microservices and monoliths, and I'm not sure if the question is geared towards like backend microservices and monoliths, or are we talking? Oh, I know what they're talking about. They're talking about, hey, normally, the convention has been, we'll have our repo over here for our single page app. We'll have our repo over here for our API. And that's kind of how we do it. But now it seems like Next.js is like this huge monolith back, kind of what we avoided. And that's kind of what I was hinting at. It's not, right? The code lives together, absolutely. But depending on where you deploy this and how you deploy it, they are completely separated and handled very nicely through React. And that has a lot to do with the server-side rendering and how that works. But it also has to do with just how they built the framework and how it handles the APIs and stuff like that. So basically, if you had a traditional monolith with like Express, that's not a bad thing. The only problem with that is when you don't put like a CDN in front of it and cache those static assets and be smart about it. Next.js does that for you. So things are always cached, things are always fast, things are always available, things are always pre-rendered. So you get the benefit of having that really nice static experience that you've been enjoying for years, but you also get that really good development experience of just having everything co-located. So you don't really give up anything by using something like Next.js. So it's a little different than what you would traditionally think of a monolith.
Authentication, are you going to get into that?
I am not going to get into authentication because it's not specific to Next.js. The way you would handle authentication in Next.js is the same way you would handle it pretty much in any React or Node application. I could talk about where you might do it, but it doesn't change anything for this framework. It's not specific to it.
You're supposed to pitch your other course.
Oh, yeah. So there's there's an advanced Next.js course where I'll dive a little deeper into some of those tactics.
Or your API design in Node kind of covers authentication as well.
Oh yeah, API design in Node does cover authentication. Yeah, I think I linked to that course somewhere in here, but not for authentication. But yeah, you can look at that course to figure out how you can do authentication in Node, and that carries over pretty well for Next.js. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull down that repo. I have it here. I'm going to check out to the start branch. If you're on the master branch, you'll actually see the complete repo, completely done. We don't want to start there. We actually just want to start at like a very blank, bare minimum repo. I mean, you can even just make a brand new one here. You don't even have to pull this down if you don't want to follow along or want to follow along on this. You just want to have your own separate repo. That's fine, because I'm basically starting from scratch here. If you open this up, you can see what I have here is literally nothing. So there's no source code in here. It's just some dot files and a package.json. So this is where we're going to be starting. We're really going to do this from scratch. So let's talk about what you or how you can get started with Next.js. And there's really two ways, and they're both stupid easy. So let's talk about the easy way, and then we'll talk about the other easy way. The first easy way is to use the create next app here, not like here, I forgot an E. Use the create next app CLI. So if you're familiar with NPX, you can use NPX create next app. If you don't know what NPX is, it basically, you can think of it as like a inline installer for a CLI. So instead of installing this CLI first and then calling the CLI, you can just put NPX in front of it and it'll, one time install the CLI right now and then execute the command without it actually being on your computer. So if you're npm, you can do that. If you like Yarn, you can Yarn and do that. So that's a very easy way. It'll scaffold out a lot of stuff for you. Really good. What we're going to do is we're going to do this other way, which is also still pretty easy. We're just going to do it manually. So to set one up from scratch, all we need to do is just install 3 dependencies. So if we're using npm, you can do npm install React, React DOM, and Next, which is the big one. If we're using Yarn, you can just Yarn add these things. So I'm using Yarn, so I'm just going to copy that. And I'm just going to Yarn add those things here. And like I said, it's really just 3 dependencies, React, React DOM, and Next. There really is nothing else. There's no router, at Next router, there's none of that. It's all here. It's all ready to go. So next, we need to add some helpful scripts to our package.json. So you can just copy these scripts here. And let's go ahead and put those into our package.json. And don't forget to put your commas there, otherwise your thing will break. And let's talk about these scripts for a little bit. So the first one here is the dev script, which just runs next. And basically what this does is it's just going to run your Next.js application in a development mode using something very similar to hop module reloading, if you've heard of that before. Or it's also, I think Next.js calls it like fast reloading or something like that. So we get that for free. If you run the build command, it's going to build your application and get it ready for production. And then you run the start command, it's actually going to start that build. And so basically you only use these two when you're ready to go to production, and you'll almost always just use this one when you're developing. So, but my computer just booted up because VS Code just eats up my CPU. So I'm just going to just kill that right quick. Let me see. Oh no, actually it's Zoom. I thought it was VS Code this time. Usually it's VS Code that has like 110% on my CPU, but okay, it's all good. Okay, let's go back to the actual thing here. And we talked about those commands. And like I said, remember, Next.js is a full stack framework. So by default, it needs to be hosted on a platform that supports Node. And the reason I'm saying that is because you'll see this Nuxt build and this Nuxt start. If you've ever only been shipping static websites, you wouldn't have a start command. Like, why would you just start a static website? It doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because this is a Node framework. And by default, because you can opt out of this, you don't have to, but by default, it does need to be deployed somewhere with Next.js, or I'm sorry, with Node.js. And we'll talk about deployment later on, but just remember that. So routing with pages in Next.js. When you're creating a vanilla React app, you have to decide, which routing library, which version you want to use. And they're all really good, and there's new ones popping up every day. And you might argue that there's standard ones out there that everyone uses, but you still have to make that decision, and you still have to install it, and you still have to set it up. And then there's many ways to set it up, and you got to hope that everyone on your team knows those ways, and they research it just as much as you. It's just a lot of overhead for something so necessary. With Next.js, you don't have to worry about that. They created the conventions, right? So this is convention over configuration. So if you follow their conventions, then everyone can actually benefit from something like a nice router. And their convention is actually just create a file. So to get started with routing and pages with Next.js, let's just head over to the code here. We're gonna open up, I'm gonna make a new folder called pages right on the root. You'll notice that you get this nice little thing here on VS Code, this little icon. And then inside here, we're just gonna make a new file. I'm gonna call it index.jsx. You can put .js if you want. If you like TypeScript, we'll talk about TypeScript later and how you can do that with Next.js. But if you like JS, you can put JS. I'm just gonna put JSX. And then all I'm gonna do is import, I'm just gonna make a vanilla React component. So nothing special here, nothing specific to Next.js. I'm just gonna import React from React. I'm gonna make a page component like this. And I'm just gonna have it return a div that says index page like that. And the most important part is need to default export that page like that. So nothing special here. Once you do that, if you're following along, you should now be able to use this dev command that we have. So I'm just gonna go back to my terminal here. I'm gonna run yarn dev like that. And you can see it says compiled successfully, which is a good sign. And right now it's on localhost 3000. So I'm just gonna open that up. Go to localhost 3000, you can see I have my index page here, right? And we got that for free. You notice, like I said, we didn't have to set up a route or anything like that. All I did was put an index.jsx file in the pages directory on the root of this application, and I was able to get an index page for free. Very simple, it doesn't get easier than that. Let's head back over to this. So like I said, you should be able to navigate there. So now if we wanna do something a little more complicated, I guess, which are like nested routes. So if you want like a path that looks something like this, so we did the index, but what if we have something like project/settings, or even something that's dynamic where it's like /user/ID, where ID is the parameter. Don't even worry, we can do that too with Next.js. So this part's gonna be a little different, and this is very specific to Next.js. I don't think I've seen any other framework take this exact convention about how they do parameters. So Next.js is very unique in this case, but it's actually pretty simple. And the way we can do that is actually just create some folders. So for instance, let's say we wanted to create some folders, or I'm sorry, we wanted to create a route for our notes. So in this case, for our note-taking app, we're gonna need the /notes route where all of our notes are gonna load up. And then we're gonna need the /notes/ID where we load one note, right? So we're gonna need both of those routes. We already have the index. So we need to make both of these. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can just head over to our pages. And then because both of these routes are going to be underneath the notes app, because this is actually, if you think of it, it's actually like the index of the notes. So there's a file in here that we have to use. And then in here, there's an ID property. So both of these are actually underneath the notes path. So we need to create a folder here called notes like that. This is going to tell the pages directory that, hey, this is a subpath, it's a nested path. And then to create the index for that, I just put index.js, right? So whenever you create an index file in a folder in the pages directory, it's going to create the route for that index of that subpath, right? And then what we can do is we can just do the same thing. I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it here. I'm just going to call this the notes index path. Like that, okay? And then when it comes to creating something dynamic, as in we need a parameter or something like that, not query strings, because you don't have to make routes for query strings. You can just use query strings just like any other app. But for parameters, the way we can do that with Next.js is we can use this syntax. So we can use these brackets like an array. And then you can put the name of the parameter. You can name the parameter whatever you want. In this case, I'm gonna call it ID. And I'm gonna say .jsx. So what this is telling Next.js is that, hey, this route is actually going to have a parameter in it called ID. So if we follow the folders, it's actually going to be, the path to this would be /notes/ID. And that's what's going to get loaded here. So I can just go ahead and paste that in here. And I can say note page like that, right? So everybody following me so far? Any questions? Okay, cool. So now if I have that, I can go here, and if I redirect to notes, you can see I'm in the note index path. like that, okay? And then if I go to notes / some random ID, you can see I'm on the note page, right? Pretty straightforward. What happens if I try to go to something else? We get a 404. So we get that for free with Next.js as well. We get a nice, arguably a very beautiful 404 page, in my opinion. I mean, that's just simple stuff like this is, I'm a big fan of. Like that's a nice 404 page. So we get that for free. So yeah, pretty cool there. Looking at this, you might have noticed this battery pack looking icon here. I didn't put this here. And if you hover over it, it says something about a pre-rendered page. You can click it. It'll take you to some place that tells you about all types of optimizations that they're doing. And we'll get to a lot of this stuff later, but basically what this is doing, it's letting you know that this page was optimized by Next.js and it was pre-rendered ahead of time. The HTML was created before it was sent to the server. So this didn't load on the client. Your React component was actually rendered on the server and sent down as HTML. And that's what this is telling you. Like, hey, this page was pre-rendered. It's letting you know that this was it. And it's actually very helpful to let you know, because as you'll find out later on in the course, you can opt in and opt out of different pre-rendering modes depending on how you fetch data. And it's very helpful to know at what time a page is pre-rendered or not during development. So it can be very helpful. Right now, it's just like, yeah, we're not doing anything. But trust me, this gets helpful in the future. And I'm a big fan of it. Let's head back here. Super awesome. The routing there, like if anyone knows a better routing setup in React, let me know, because that was pretty easy. Gatsby does something very similar as well. They use the file system. They have a plugin that reads the file system. That plugin is built into Gatsby by default. And their syntax is just a little different. I think they use like underscores for parameters and not the array brackets, but you get pretty much the same results. So I'm a big fan of Gatsby's routing as well. Cool. We talked about the index stuff there. Let's talk about how do we access the dynamic, the parameters of that route, right? So for instance, we have this ID here inside this route. This isn't really useful for us unless why would we make this if we're not going to use the ID, right? Like we need this ID to do something. So this is, how we interact with that is going to depend on how we render the page. But for right now, until we get to different rendering modes, we're only really just talking about like client-side rendering. So everything here is just regular React for now. I'll let you know when we're not doing regular React stuff. But for now, everything's just regular React. So in that case, we can actually use the router lib from Next.js, which I believe is called Next Router, like that. So we can import this. I need ESLint. I can't stand double quotes. And I think the one that we want is going to be called, what is it? Use router. There we go. So use router. If you've never used React hooks before, this is a React hook. Most React hooks start with the use word. We're not going to get into React hooks. There's a really good course at Front End Masters. I want to say, I think the V5 course actually covers hooks. So you should check that one out from Brian Holt. That one covers hooks in more detail. I could talk a little bit about it if it's confusing to someone, but I'm actually just going to keep moving. But basically, we can use this use router hook, which is going to give us the actual router, and then we can inspect that router and get the parameters, or parameter in this case, associated with this page. So what I can do is I can say, give me the router, which is going to be use router, like that. And it's also note that if you aren't using functional components, and if you don't know the difference between this in React and something like a class component, the difference is this component is, you can think of it as the whole function is a render function. This is the render function. Whereas a class component, you manually have to create a render function and everything else is not the render function, right? In the function component, this whole thing is the render function. And that's why hooks are here. Hooks allows us to opt into what we would traditionally have methods, whereas a class component, it's the other way. You opt into the render function by writing render. So just remember that. So that's kind of where hooks are. But the reason I'm saying that is because if you use class components, there's a with router, higher order component that will wrap your class component that gives you access to the same router object. So they're both the same. This is for class components. This is for functional components. So we're going to use the functional component, and we're going to get the router. And then what we want to do is we want to grab the ID. So we can say ID, like this is actually going to be an object. So I'm going to destructure, and that's going to be from router.query. So router.query is going to be an object with any associated params on there. And I want the ID param. And the reason I know it's ID is because that's what I put in the file name. It's whatever I put in the file name. If I put blah, 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 that's what this will be. It'll be blah, 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 right? So I put ID, so I'm going to get back an ID here. So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return a component like this. And I'm going to say note ID like that, right? So now we should be able to see this ID inside of our JSX. So let's save that. Let's go back to our app, and you can see that is the ID that I put here in the URL, right? If I put 1, then I'll get 1, right? So pretty useful, pretty easy to get those query params. Again, I just want to emphasize that that ID that I put in the bracket is simply the same name as the file, right? So it's query, which is an object, and it has tons of properties on it that will match the file name. And I say tons because you can actually have more than one parameter in there in one file. And that might not make sense because you might be thinking like, well, I can't have 2 parameters in one path, right? I can't have something like, something like this where you had a route that was like slash, user slash, and then you had like some parameter here called ID, but then you had another parameter here that was like thing. Yeah, you can't do that. There's not going to be 2 parameters in there. So when would you ever have 2 parameters inside of a query object for one page? Yeah, technically that's not possible, but Next.js gives you something called catch-all routes, which kind of make that virtually possible, which is really interesting. And I think it's a very nifty feature that I take advantage of all the time, whenever I can. But basically, catch-all routes are exactly what they sound like. They basically are like a glob pattern. You can say, for instance, if you're writing a get ignore and you're like, I just want to get ignore everything after this folder, and you put 2 stars, right? So it'll capture everything after that path. You can do the same thing with the router. You can say, all right, I want to go to this path, and I want to capture everything after here. And it's really amazing. And in my opinion, it's kind of lazy because, yeah, you could just make a page for every single possible parameter that you'll ever have inside your pages directory. But why would you do that? You should just be lazy because lazy developers are good developers. Remember that. So that's basically what we're going to do. So what does the syntax look like for a catch-all route? It kind of looks like this. So you just make a file with the same brackets, except for you put this ellipses in front of a parameter name. That ellipses is going to tell Next.js that you want to catch everything after docs. It's going to capture everything there. And then we're able to use it inside of our params. So let's go back and let's just make a new page just for the fun of it. I'm going to make a new one here, or maybe not in notes. I'll just refactor the ID one to do it just for fun. So I'm going to make this one. I'm going to put dot, dot, dot. And again, you don't have to put params here. You can put whatever you want. It doesn't matter, but I think params makes sense, and you'll see why in a minute. So I'm going to put params here. This ID is no longer going to be ID because I don't have ID here. It's now params, so that's not going to work. So I need to change this to, you guessed it, params. Oh, not that. Params. So now this matches with this. So the only difference is, whereas before ID was, the value of that ID, params is going to be an array. It's going to be an array of all the matching params that match in order that you route it to. So for instance, if I had a route that looked like this, in this case, it was /notes /1/2/3/4. Oops, I said comma. /2/3/4. Params is going to be an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, right? In that order. That's what params is going to be. So let's actually just log this out so we can see what I'm talking about. Params, and we can even just, I'll just do that. Do that, and then we'll log those params, and then we will route to it. So right now, this still renders, right? Everything still works. Obviously, this isn't going to show because I got rid of it, but if we open up the DOM and we look at this array here, you can see I have one thing inside of it, and that's the first ID. So let's do something a little more human readable. So I'll put 1 here, boom. And then I'll put slash and I'll put 2. Boom, there's 2. And then I'll put 3. Right, and it just goes on forever. We can capture all those params in an array, which is extremely useful, and it's not something we've normally done in most applications. In fact, you might be thinking like, well, when the hell would I ever use this? Like, when would I ever use a scenario where I want to use the same component for many different pages, right? So you might not even be thinking about a use case for it, because we actually never, at least in my opinion, I've never seen or had the need to do something like that. And it wasn't until I saw this feature that I realized that, like, wow, it actually can be applied to a lot of things that I've done in the past that would have made it a lot easier. And we'll talk about some of those things. It's really cool to do the catch-all routes. They're really impressive. One extra feature on top of that is what they call the optional catch-all routes. And basically what that does, the only difference between an optional catch-all and a catch-all is that the optional catch-all is also like inclusive. So it will also include the parent path inside of it. And the way you do that is you just add another bracket around your brackets here. So not only will this match all the params that we did above, but it will also match docs. Basically, that's what you get. And the value of that parent path will just be an empty object because it doesn't have any params. There's nothing there. So it'll just be an empty object in place for that path there. So again, just extremely powerful. Yeah, the syntax looks kind of weird. If someone came in and looked at your file system, they're like, well, why are you naming your files that way? Yeah, they might think you were kind of weird, but this works very well. I haven't used the catch-all, the optional catch-all in production yet, but I use the catch-all one all the time, consistently all the time. And specifically for some of the things that I use it for, it's basically useful for whenever you have a bunch of pages that have pretty much the exact same layout or very close to the same layout, but they need their own URL. So if you think about it in that case, what is something that pretty much has the exact same layout, but they have different URLs? Documentation. Documentation is a big one. Like if you go to any documentation website, the layout's always the same. I don't care what thing you click on the left, but the layout's always the same. The styling is always the same. It's only the content that's different. And they all have their own URL, for SEO and searchable reasons. So documentation is perfect for this. So instead of generating a page for every single, documentation page that you want, you can just make one route that does a catch-all and says, yeah, I just want to catch all this documentation stuff. And yeah, that's basically it. And then you can do whatever you want with those params, which is really impressive. So you get to save some time versus, a smart developer would, generate all those pages, but then they would go make like a template or a layout. And they would reuse that layout on every single page. And that way they're not writing the same thing over and over again. This is taking it to the next level. You don't even need the layout. You don't even need the template. You just make one page and you don't have to generate the rest, which can also save you time when you generate these pages when we get to static generation and stuff like that. So really, really good ability, really good feature here. Cool. So the last thing I want to talk about is like, okay, we talked a lot about pages. That's cool. But what about like non-pages? This is a component-based framework. So how do I create components that aren't pages? Because what if I just want to put a button? But if I put a button inside of pages, it's going to make a route called button, and I don't want to do that. Okay, yeah, good point. There's no convention inside of Next.js that tells you how to create components or where, but the community mostly just creates a source folder, or not in there though, creates a source folder on the root. And normally we just create a folder called components, just like you would do in any old React app. And that's where we put our components. You just put your components in there, right? The other thing to note is that if for some reason this bothers you about having the pages directory on the root, which I can see why it would, especially now that we have a source folder, like, okay, I want everything in source if that's the source. I don't want pages on the root if we have a source. That's kind of gross. You can move the pages into the source and that will work as well. But if you have both, Next.js will use the pages on the root. That would take precedence. So if it's really bothering you, you can move the pages into the source and it works just fine. Just don't put both. So just remember that. And again, if you didn't feel like following along or if I was moving too fast, you can check out on the repo to this branch. You can just copy and paste that and you should check out to exactly where we just ended Now, the code that you'll check out to will exactly be all this code that's in here. So all this code is copy and pasteable. So everything you see here comes directly from the repo. So it'll be the same thing that you see here, and it'll probably be slightly different than what I just live coded right here. So this is the source of truth. All right, navigation. What's routing if we can't navigate between pages, right? So, how do we do that? It's a little different than what you would normally do, but if you've ever used any routing framework, then it'll feel very familiar. So basically, Next.js gives us a link component, okay? So this link component allows us to route between pages. The important thing to remember here though, and this is where it starts to get a little challenging to think about, especially if you've never dealt with like server-side rendering or pre-rendering, is that the link component is only used to navigate for client-side transitions, right? And when I say client-side, I mean literally using the HTML5 push state, browser, and it's navigating purely on the client side. There's no request to the server, and you'll see when we do this what I'm talking about. So this is only for client-side routing. So if you're trying to get that SPA-like fast navigation behavior, you use the link component, right? And that's what it's used for. If you're not trying to do client-side routing because you're going to an external link or you just want to force a re-render, then you just use an anchor tag, which is, HTML already has. So the link tag is what Next.js gives us. And let's just talk about it a little bit. So it's a little different than what you might have used before. So the first thing is that it has this href prop on it, which is very similar to an href on an anchor tag, except it actually doesn't take an href. So you're not going to put a full URL here. Remember, this is client-side routing, so everything is going to be pretty much relative here. But what you want to put here is actually going to be the path to the name of the page, right? So for instance, the name of this page, index.js, would be /notes/ or it would just be /notes because it's the index of notes. So it's relative to the pages directory. So that's the name of the page. So that's what you would put in that href. So let's give it a try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my index page. I'm going to import this link from next link like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just link to some pages here. So we'll do this. And let's get rid of this thing right quick. Put the H1, put that back in there. And then I'm just going to make a quick little link here. So you can say link like this. And then we'll put an href. And remember, I got to put the name of the page as it is in the pages directory. So in this case, I want to navigate to notes. That's the name of this page. The other thing is that you can't just put like note in here like this. So let me show you why. So if I go back and I go to my index page and I click on note, okay, in this case, oh, hold on, actually, before I say something, let me just make sure. Okay, yeah, it was smart about it. Okay, so in this case, they took the href and they knew what I was doing and they implied, but it's actually safe to actually put an anchor tag in here, excuse me, with no href and wrap that around your content. And that's actually recommended in the docs. So if I do that, you get the same thing here. And I think what that does is it passes the href respectively to the anchor tag without losing context in the URL, or at least that's what it used to do. It looks like they just imply it now. So I guess that's good because I always hated wrapping the A, but because it always just looks weird with no href. And sometimes you'll have like an ESLint linter that'll be like, oh, you can't have an anchor tag with an href, and then you got to go disable that. And it's just like really annoying. But I highly recommend just wrapping your content inside of a link tag and an anchor tag. That's what you're going to see in this course, and that's actually what they recommend in the documentation. But it does look like they do some optimizations there with that. But I think those optimizations work because it's such a simple route. When we get to more complicated things, it won't work. So this is pretty much how you use the link tag when navigating to a static path. Now, when we want to navigate to a dynamic path, as in this params thing here, and actually I'm just going to change this back to being just an ID, since that's what we're going to be using in our app. If I want to navigate there, it's a little more work, not too difficult. So what I'll do is I'll go to the index notes page here. And I'm going to say this is the index note page. And then I'm going to make a link tag as well. Let me import it up top first. Like that. And make a link component like that. So very similar, I'm going to add an href. And I'm going to link to /notes/ literally the name of it. So I have to put that. This is the name of that file. Like that, well, not JSX, but just that. So I'm gonna put the name, which is exactly what it is here. It's a bracket with an ID. So this is why I said href is a little different than the href from an anchor tag. You're not actually putting a URL here. This is not the URL to this page. This is the name of the page. This is the path to the page. So that's why I put that here. So how do I actually pass in an ID? Well, if we want to pass in an ID, what you would do is you would say as. And then as takes in a string. So, and then this will take the actual URL. So I can say, oh, well, I want to navigate to, /1 like that, right? Or if you had some type of variable, you can put that variable here, right? We don't have a variable, so I'm just going to put 1, right? So that's going to allow us to link to a notes page here. So I can say, this is a note for note 1 like that. And actually anchor tag. Like that. So we can go to our notes index page. Or did I put that in the wrong file? Wait. There we go. Here we go. And then I can click on note 1, which will bring us to the note 1 page. All right. Pretty simple. They make linking pretty simple. And again, if you need to link somewhere else, you still got a straight up anchor tag. Just link out, it works the same way. This is only for client-side routing. Any questions on that? Nope. And yeah, you can hear me talking about that tip for the linter. You can tell it really bothered me, that accessibility issue with the hrefs and anchor tags and stuff like that. So yeah, fix that. Pretty annoying. All right, and then you can see here, I just have a bunch of copy and paste stuff here to follow along, but we just live coded. So feel free to copy this stuff into the pages that I just did. I think the only difference that I'm doing here that I didn't do is I just put a whole bunch of notes on the page and I linked to them. So you can do that too if you want to. In fact, you know what? I'll just go ahead and copy that so we can be consistent. And I'll just put that here in the ID page like that. So we have a nice, consistent experience here with some notes like that. Now let's go to programmatic routing. So we talked about routing with the link tag, which is really cool. But what if you need to, route programmatically using JavaScript, right? Sometimes you need to do that on some type of event. This person clicked, this response came in, I need to do something, I need to route programmatically. That's where the router comes back in. So far we've been using the router for the query, but we can also use the router to navigate. And it's actually really simple because to me, it's just like a proxy on top of the HTML push state router, which has pretty much the same methods. So if you don't have any experience with that, that's fine. Everything extracts that anyway. Every router uses that. So I don't expect you to have experience with that router unless you've built a router library. But this thing pretty much just proxies that. So for instance, if we want to navigate like this, we can make a button. We can say like on click, and then we can push to a router. We're not going to do this in our note-taking app, so I'm not going to just put this in there. But just an example, that's how you would do it. I also linked to all the many methods that exist on this router. There's, I don't know, close to, there's well over 10. There's a lot of methods because like I said, it really proxies the HTML5 push state router. So there's a lot of things you can do on there like refresh, replace instead of push if you want to just change the history, different things like that, which is really good for query strings, stuff like that. Yeah, you can look at those methods, but the most common one is push, and that's how you would do it. The important thing to remember about push is that it pretty much acts very much like link. It takes the same two arguments. So it's going to take the name of the page, right? So in this case, the name is slash, or in this case, the name is just like we had before. And then the as is the actual resolved path, right? So takes the same arguments. It's not the same as the HTML5 push state, but it is the same method name push. So just a little different here. And I think that's pretty much the most important thing that you would need to know in Next.js, as far as when it comes to routing programmatically. And again, this is only for client-side routing. You're not going to be routing on a server with this. Everything inside of this component is client-side, right? Like this logic, you can't do an on-click, you can't click a button on the server, right? So all this happens on the client, right? So remember that. Any questions on routing and navigation with Next.js?
Is there a reason why you need the as in this case, or can you leave that
out? The reason you need the as in this case is because without this, how would Next.js know what the value of this ID is? Without you telling Next.js that, hey, the actual value of this ID parameter is actually note.id, it would not know. So you do have to put the as there. And as is only going to be for dynamic routes. If you don't have a dynamic route, like you're just navigating to a route that's hard-coded like /settings, you don't need as because you know the path of it. You can just say, go here. But if your name of your route has a parameter in it, then you need to let Next.js know how to resolve that parameter and do this. So this just tells Next.js like, okay, what component, what page are we loading? Because it's doing some prefetching stuff. That's the other thing. Next.js is doing a lot of prefetching stuff in the background that you get for free with the link component. And then the as one is mostly for the browser. Like, okay, here's where I want you to go. And here's where I kind of want you to prefetch, that type of thing. So yes, you do need to ask for parameters in the URL.
Do all routes have to be declared from the root of the pages folder?
So all
right, like when you're doing link.
So when you're doing link, oh, I see what you're saying. Like this relativity here.
Yeah, does it always have to be relative to the root of the pages folder, or like if I don't do the slash, will it derive it from my current folder?
I don't think it's relative. I think it's relative to the pages folder. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any SEO considerations when using link?
Are there any SEO considerations? No, I mean, no more considerations than you would have if you're using any other client-side router. Because like I said before, it only proxies the HTML5 push state experience, which depending on, where you're trying to get this site indexed, if you're getting indexed by Google does index JavaScript now, it does crawl JavaScript. So you shouldn't have a problem there if you didn't have them before. But, things like Twitter and Facebook, I don't think they crawl JavaScript yet. So yeah, you might have issues there. And again, this is for client-side routing. But also remember that by default, Next.js is going to pre-render every single page by default. So when it comes to being indexed and crawl, all of this is from the crawler's experience. This is going to be HTML anyway. This is for after a rehydration happens. So your page gets turned into a string on the server and gets sent back to the browser as HTML. It gets sent to a crawler as HTML. And then it rehydrates on the front end, which is basically, you could think of it as like, this JavaScript comes down, it looks at the DOM to figure out where it needs to mount. It matches its DOM with what the server sent down to see if they're the same. And then it does some stuff with JavaScript to inject some props. That's rehydration, right? All that's happening. But that's for your users. That's for the browser. As far as the crawlers see, they're going to see the HTML, unless you opt out of that.
It seems that they're saying that if you take the as block and just put it into the href and remove as, it still works. Is there any problem with doing it that way?
No, I don't think there's any problem with doing it that way. I'm not aware of any side effects that might be. The only thing I could think of, and I can't confirm this because I just haven't looked into it, is that you might be opting out of prefetching if you do that with the link component. I could look into that later if someone else wants to look into it, but That might be the case because I think they need to know this in order to do some type of optimized prefetching. But again, I could be wrong. But this is the recommended approach. So I'm guessing they recommend it for a reason. And I'm pretty sure it's for prefetching.
The routing happens on the client side, but all of the routes have already been pre-rendered, right? Because of the server-side render.
Yeah, the navigating using the link component happens on the client side, but the actual routes were defined at build time. So let's talk about one of my favorite parts, which is styling. I'm a really big, like when it comes to writing code, I'm just all about experience, and making really good, really good feeling experiences for users. And, a lot of that has to do with design. So I know a lot of developers is like, oh, CSS and stuff like that for good reason, but me, I actually am one of those weird people that like CSS and obsessed about making things look picture perfect. Like when I was working at companies, I would spend half my time sitting next to the designers, working with them to design the app, because that's just like what I like doing. But I'm by no means a designer. Don't ask me to design anything, I couldn't do it. But I can recognize good design. And I think that's kind of where my value is. So styling, if you use React, which I'm hoping all you have, you could probably think of at least 5 ways to do styling in React, right? And that's going to depend on how you build it, right? You got, so many different flavors of CSS and JS. You have different ways of making CSS files, and then Webpack can import them different ways. Like, well, do you want a global? Do you want me to put them together? Do you want me to maybe add modules to them? Like, what do you want me to do? It's just so many ways to do styling in React. And I think the Next.js team was aware of that, right? So they was like, you know what? We're going to pick something that covers some use cases and it works very well, and we're just going to do that. And I think they did a really good job with the styling when it comes to Next.js. So let's talk about that. So like I said, they do have some conventions baked in, and they're pretty good by default. And they basically look like this. So you have, let's talk about the 2 different types of stylings first, right? So you have global styles, right? You have, I need this CSS to be globally inside of my application. It will have collisions. I don't really care. And that's because, a good example of that, and, maybe you're not writing that, but let's say you download and you npm install a calendar component. And that calendar component says, you got to import this CSS. That's global styling, right? Hopefully no one's writing libraries like that anymore. If you are writing libraries like that, please don't write libraries where someone has to import CSS. It's just so many better ways, and it really conflicts with their build system. So don't do that. But, there's still so many libraries out there that do that. So how do you get that, into your app with Next.js? So Next.js is very specific about that. So the only way to include global CSS inside of your application, your Next.js application, is inside of a special page called _app, right? So I'm gonna show you what that is. So if I go to my pages, I can make a new file here called _app. Right. So before we get in here, I think this introduces another conversation. So this means that, okay, there's a special page in this pages directory. So that, that would mean that, like, okay, you probably can't pick whatever name you want for your pages, because Next.js is using specific names for specific pages. So if you were going to make a route called _app here, this wouldn't, like, it wouldn't pick it up, right? So you can't use whatever names you want. And there's other ones in here too as well, but most of them start with _. So it's usually safe. Hopefully you're not making a route with an underscore in it for some reason. I don't know. If you are, just pick something else. I don't know. But yeah, _app is basically allows us to hijack the root, the entry point to our Next.js application. This gets created for us for free by default. We never have to touch it unless we got to make some global styling, right? So the way that works is, you can look here. I mean, at the end of the day, you're just going to export a function here. You're going to get the this component here, which is going to be a page. So here's a page. At any given time, this is a page. And then it props to that page. So you just return it. This is basically what Next.js is doing under the hood. They're doing this for you automatically, so you don't have to do it yourself, right? So you could copy this, you can paste this, and obviously you need to import React. right? And this is what happens for you automatically. So just by adding this, I actually don't get any benefit. But the reason I have to add this file is because I can't actually add any global CSS in any other file inside of Next.js, for better or for worse, other than this file. So if I had that button or that calendar and I needed some CSS for it, I would have to do it here. You know, it would have to be calendar, or, you know, whatever that thing is for that calendar, it would have to be here. You can't do it anywhere else. If you try to import this CSS in a component or anything that's not, or even in a page, anything that's not this underscore app, you're going to get an error from Next.js that says, oh, you can't do that. And we can test that, right? So I can go and I'm going to go to source and I'm going to make a new file. I'm just going to call it styles.css. And I'll add some styles here. Like that, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import that in my index page. And let's see what happens. So I'm going to say imports source/style.css. All right, so let's see what happens if we try to do that. Boom. Like I said, you get this really nice, huge error. It immediately threw up. It was like, nope, not happening. Global CSS cannot be imported from files other than your custom app. Please move all global CSS imports to that, or convert it to CSS modules, which is what we will be talking about next. So the reason they do that, it has a lot to do with like the bundling of the styles and how they treat the global styles to make sure they are loaded and properly. So it makes sense, but that can also be a headache. But I also realize that headache is mostly due because people are still making libraries with global CSS exports. I don't know why they still do that. Just don't do that. It's not a good experience. And you will almost never make global CSS if you're the author of this application. You will most likely never do that. So it usually is always some NPM module that requires you to do that. So yeah, that sucks. I'm at the point now where if I come across one of those models and I need it, I will literally just fork it and make the CSS not an import and publish an NPM myself and use that one. That's how bad of a problem it is for me now. I like fork modules. I fork like 10 modules a week now, just doing stuff like that. So yeah, it's that big of a problem. All right, but if we do add that, oops, not this. But if we do add that CSS here to our custom app, so if I say source styles.css here, hey, it works. It loaded up just fine, right? So yeah, global CSS, import it in your app component, have a happy day. Hopefully you never have to do it. Now, the part that you're actually going to be using is Next.js' support for CSS modules. So if you've never heard of CSS modules, basically what they do is they allow you to write your CSS the way you normally write it. But the way that it works is during build time, every time you import that CSS file into a file, every single import is going to dynamically create a class, a dynamic class just for that import. And it's going to apply it for all the styles on that import. So even though you have the same CSS classes and you might import the same file in many components, they're all going to have their own scoped class in front of them because it's unique to that import. And that happens at build time. So that's how the scoping works with CSS modules. They just basically get a dynamic, unique class associated with them per import. And Next.js gives us that for free because I remember when CSS modules first came out, like, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that. It was so hard to set up. It was ridiculous setting it up with Webpack and all that stuff. And now you get it for free. We kind of take it for granted. So, how would you do CSS modules and where would you use them? So you can pretty much use CSS modules anywhere, even the app.js, any page, any component, doesn't matter. It'll just work. So, the way a CSS modules works is all you have to do is just rename the file. So in this case, style.css, I would say styles.module.css. That's it. All I have to do is put the word module in it. And this is going to tell Next.js that, oh, this is a CSS module. Cool, got you. And this is now going to allow you to import it in any file. And that CSS is going to be scoped to that file. So even if I import it in many places, it won't collide, right? And it won't collide with any of the global stuff. So now that I have this, I can go back to my page here. I can put that in there, and then I can say .module.css like that, right? Yeah, and then now it's just freaking out because I'm trying to do a body. CSS modules doesn't allow you to do like pure selectors like that, right? So I need to just dot body, something like that. There we go. And the reason that freaked out is because CSS modules needs a class name in order to like put a dynamic class name in front of you. You can't do that because if you attach the body, that's global, right? You're global now. That's defeating the purpose of CSS modules. So it's like, hey, you wanted modules, but you're not doing modules. What are you doing? Go make some global CSS. So that's why we got that error, which is very helpful. Now let's just talk about my approach to styling in React applications. So for what we're going to use in this course and just my recommended approach, I like to use something called Theme UI. So if you've never heard of Theme UI, this will be a soft introduction to the Theme UI. This is not a Theme UI course. I think it could literally be a course by itself. So I won't be going into like every detail and nook and cranny about Theme UI, but I will be using it and you'll learn through examples and I'll talk about it as we go. But this is actually how I prefer to style my React app. So if you were to click on a Theme UI website, which is really cool, which by the way, they do support Black Lives Matter, which is really dope. They got like all the names on here. But if you click here and go to the documentation, which is also a really good documentation website, you can see here that it says Theme UI is a library for creating themable user interfaces based on constraint-based design principles. What does that actually mean? We'll find out. But basically, TLDR, you can create an object representing a theme, and then you can use that theme for all your components. That's basically it. And to me, it's a lot simpler for me to style using Theme UI than anything I've ever used. So that's what we're going to be doing. So we are going to add this to our app. So if you're using NPM, you can NPM install all the things here. There's really only two dependencies that we need. We need the actual Theme UI, and then we need the @theme UI /presets, which is basically going to give us some default themes to start from. So we're not starting from scratch. You can think of it as the equivalent of like, oh, I'm creating a brand new React app. I want to import some normalized.css. I want to import Tailwind, like just some a CSS library, basically. This is the equivalent of that, except for our CSS, our styles are represented in JavaScript, which is, that's how React does things. So what we'll do is we're going to create a theme in a file called theme.js. So what we can do is we can go to the root of our app and we're gonna make a file called theme.js like that. And we're gonna create a theme here. Luckily for you, I already have everything you need. So you can just copy this theme and then I'll paste it and I'll talk about it a little bit. So what's going on here with this? First thing is we have this preset here. And like I said, preset is just a starting point to our theme. A theme object, there is a specific set of properties that should be on here and stuff like that. You can go look at the spec if you're interested on Theme UI. So there's a spec for a theme like colors, sizes, fonts, different things like that. So I'm just using the Roboto one that I got from Theme UI. You can go check it out. Actually, I'll just show you what that looks like. So if I go to the documentation, I can go to packages, and then I can go to presets. I'll make this a little bigger, and then I can click on Roboto. So I'm using this preset. It comes with these colors by default. Here's the text, here's the background, here's the primary, secondary, muted, highlight, gray, accent, darken, all this stuff. Here's the fonts, here's the font scale. It's got all this stuff ready to go. Literally fonts, everything ready to go. I don't have to do anything. I just install it and I'm done, right? So I'm using this preset. You can pick any preset or none if you want to. And I'm just going to extend over that. And then I'm going to just add my own properties here. So the thing about Theme UI is that you can it's like making components almost, right? So just like you can make custom components, for instance, I might make a card component or I might make a page component, and those components would have these styles. I'm doing the same thing here. You can think of these as like CSS components. I'm making components in just CSS. So I'm making a CSS component called card and a CSS component called page. And I can add these, what they call variants. These are actually called variants. I can add these variants to any component that I want inside of my React app. I guess another way you could think of it is like, these are just CSS classes, right? You can think of this as like containers-card or containers-page. That's a CSS class. And that's basically what I'm doing here. So, and you can put whatever CSS property you want here. The other really cool thing is that you can refer to predefined values. So muted is not a color that's in the browser, but I'm able to use it here because I know Roboto defines a color called muted. And I'm able to refer to that here. So you can actually put theme values in here as well. So not just CSS values, but theme values, which is where the power comes from. And this is a lot to take in, but you'll see in a minute. And then styles, this is just for global style. So this will basically allow us to style things that are global. Like for instance, if you were doing Markdown or MDX or something like that, this will just apply to styles to that. So really cool. So if you really want to see what's popping here, you just log this. So I think it's better if we just log this. So I'm just gonna log this theme. And then the next thing is we need to actually add this theme to our site. Oh, oops, why did I do that? The way to do that is we need a provider. So Theme UI comes with a provider to wrap all of our, entire document. So there's two ways we can use providers in Next.js. And that brings us to this point is you could, because if you think about it, every page in Next.js is its own app. I didn't really talk about this, but you get code splitting for free based off routing, right? Again, if you ever configure Webpack, that's not something you can easily do. I mean, you really got to understand a lot about the build systems and performance and all the different features and plugins out there and trade-offs and environments that you're running in. You get this for free with Next.js. You get that nice code splitting. So you can think of every single page as its own application. So in that case, yeah, we could just add a provider around every single page. I could just go into every single page and wrap every single one of these in a theme provider. But that's kind of annoying. And I only have, a couple pages. If I had more pages, it would just be so annoying. I wouldn't want to do that. So, where's one place where I can do this? Well, in the app. The app is the root. It takes every single page, which is this, and it returns it, right, with a prop. So this is the perfect place to add things like providers and stuff like that. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to import the theme provider and we're going to wrap our entire application. So let's do that. So I'm going to say imports from theme UI. And what I want is a theme provider like that. And I'm just going to cut that right quick. And then I'm going to add the theme provider like this. And I'm just going to put that back in there. And then the only thing the theme provider takes that we really care about is going to be a theme. And guess what? We just made a theme. It's right here on the root. It's called theme.js. It's the thing that we're exporting here. We can just import it here. So we'll just import this theme from, where is it at? Where am I at? Source. Oh, there we go. Theme. And we'll just paste in, or we'll just type in theme there. So now we have our theme. We have our theme provider. It's going to wrap every single page. If we go look at our app now, hold up. Something broke? No, nothing broke. Hold up. Theme provider theme. Okay. If we look at our app now, we should be able to see. Oh, I think I got to. Yeah, there we go. I was going to say something. Let me rebuild this. Okay. There we go. Okay. So if we rebuild this, you'll see instantly, it just looks better. The fonts got changed. Yeah, we still need some spacing and stuff, and we're going to get to that next. But I mean, you can see the font got changed, the color, the text changed a little bit. Everything just got instantly applied here. And if we look at this object that we're logging, which is our theme, we can actually see what is on this object. So like I said, there's colors. So you can see some predefined colors here. You can see the background is this, muted is that, primary is this, secondary is that. It's pretty simple. Here's even the text. And just to show you the power of this, if I were to go to my theme, and let's say I wanted to change the colors right quick. I can say colors. I'm just gonna take whatever Roboto had there for their colors. I'm gonna spread over that. And then I'm gonna change, I don't know, the background to be yellow. Ooh, that's kind of nasty. So if we do that, now the background's yellow, right? Very easy, very simple. I didn't even touch any component. I didn't do anything. It just happened automatically. All I did was just touch this object which was super simple, right? And if you think about it, because this is just JavaScript, what's really cool about this is, let's say, for instance, you wanted to test the theme, the way your site looks. If your entire site and every single component used properties on this theme, testing how your site looks could be as simple as just testing this object. Does this object equal this object? You can do a snapshot test on this object to see if it equals what it was before, to make sure your site always looks the same, right? There's something that you can do there. So it gets really powerful. And obviously you can see the power when it comes to extensibility. You can extend themes and do all types of stuff like that. But yeah, very powerful. Actually, that looks really good, yellow. Kind of reminds me of Kill Bill. So that was really nice. Okay, that strangely worked out. I thought that was gonna be ugly, but it was actually really dope. So yeah, that's theme UI. You can see other things like font sizes and font weights. It also handles responsive design very well. I'm not gonna get into that, but honestly, it's the best use of responsive, like the best mechanism to handle responsive design that I've ever seen in my entire life. I think they do it so well that I don't dread it anymore. So really dope there. Highly recommend checking out theme UI. But enough about that. Let's make our app look pretty. So, because right now it kind of just looks gross and it doesn't really do anything. So I have all of that stuff ready for copy and paste down here. So because it is a lot of stuff, I'm just going to copy it. So the first thing is we actually are going to create a navigation component. So go to your components folder, make a nav.jsx and paste this stuff in it. There we go. All right, so we're gonna make a nav.jsx here. And I'm just gonna paste that in here. Okay. You might see some funny stuff going on. All right, let's talk about this funny stuff. First of all, what is this? Why is this comment up here? Is this just a regular JavaScript comment? And if so, why is it lit up like that in VS Code? VS Code seems to know what it is. And then why am I importing JSX from theme UI, but I'm not actually using it anywhere? I mean, other than these comments, I guess. And then the last thing, what is this SX property on these HTML elements? I don't remember these HTML elements having a SX property on them. Yes, let's talk about that. This is what theme UI does. So the first thing is, this is what's called JavaScript, Pragma. So if you don't know what that means, which who knows what that means, it's basically a hint or a directive to tell the compiler, which in this case will be Babel most likely, that, hey, I'm going to let you know that when you go compile JSX, I actually want you to use this JSX tool to compile JSX and not React. And it's actually for the same reason why you always have to import React at the top of your app. I don't know if you've ever realized, like, why do I always have to import React inside of a JSX component, even though I never use it? Well, it's because the compiler needs to know how to compile JSX. There's a JSX lib inside of here that tells the compiler how to do it. That's why you always have to import React at the top of your file. And then the React, the Babel plugin and stuff knows how to get it from React, and it knows how to compile. Well, we're not going to use the React compiler. We're going to use this JSX compiler, which does the exact same thing as the React compiler, with the extra benefit of allowing us to use an SX property on every single element. And this XX property, basically, you could think of this as inline styles. So if you were to put like a style prop on an element and you were to add some styles to it, this is the same thing, except it has a different output. The output of this SX property is actually not going to be inline styles on your element. So you won't be able to go in the DOM and inspect the inline styles. This is actually going to create CSS for you and add it to the head of your document. And it's going to be scoped as well. So it's going to scope it just like CSS modules do. And then it's going to, for every single page that you have here, it's going to create a link tag in the document. It's going to put that scoped CSS in there. And then it's going to add class names to all your elements with those scoped class names. So it's doing all of that for you for free, which I think is amazing. So not only do you get that nice ability of adding inline styles, but you also get to refer to theme variables here. So for instance, I have primary. That's because I have a color called primary defined somewhere. And I could do shortcuts like BG, which is short for background. I don't have to do things like that. Or for instance, if I wanted to do something like padding left, I can just say PL for padding left. And I can put padding left here. So there's like a lot of really cool stuff in here that I highly recommend. And it's all TypeScript. So you can just get some autocomplete and see what's happening here. It's really cool. If you prefer not to be able to use like these shortcuts and these, theme stuff, but you just want to do just pure CSS, Theme UI JSX also adds a CSS property here too that pretty much does the same thing minus the ability to interact with theme variables and have shortcuts. So this is just like pure CSS. This is like CSS plus theming. So really, really cool. So that's, if you haven't figured it out right now, this is why I like Theme UI, because it's super simple. And in fact, you can even get rid of all of this like this, and you can define these in your theme object as variants. So instead of putting all this in here like I'm doing, I can say, I'm gonna make a header variant in my theme and like headers, and then I'm just gonna refer to it inside of my file. I'm just gonna refer to it, in here, I'm just gonna say like variant equals header, and then that's it. And that way you can literally define all your stuff in one place. So changing your styles for everything in your app is as simple as going to one file and then changing them here. You never have to go look at a component again to change the style, which in my experience is extremely helpful because you can even get a designer to do it if you want it. A designer could just come in here and just like change this object and control exactly how the site looks like without a developer ever having to go look at JSX or anything like that, which to me is extremely powerful. So highly recommend checking out Theme UI. All right, so we got our nav components. The next thing we'll do, any questions on that? That was a lot. I talked about pragma, compilers, directives, SX, any questions on that? And again, this is not specific to Next.js. This is just how I prefer. And I think it's something I just wanted to talk about and talk about here. But the specific things are, like I said, the how we use the providers and stuff like that. This is specific to Next.js.
Can you compare Theme UI to Tailwind?
Yes. So I'm pretty sure so Theme UI is associated with Gatsby. I'm not sure if Gatsby created Theme UI or something like that, but it's definitely associated with Gatsby. And I want to say the folks at Tailwind also have something to do with Theme UI, as I read in the GitHub issue somewhere. But I'm pretty sure Theme UI is their next version of that. They took what they learned from Tailwind and they applied it to Theme UI. In fact, if you go to Theme UI, you can look, there's a preset here. I don't know if it's on here. Is it on here? Yeah, there's a Tailwind preset for Theme UI. So I think Tailwind is like the best example of how to get really good out of the box experience with CSS. The only thing about Tailwind is that, right, you're still using, class names and stuff like that, but they're really good. Theme UI doesn't use class names. If you saw, I didn't write one single class name here at all. All my class names are generated for me. And then also Theme UI is themable. Like for instance, on this documentation website, the way that I'm able to switch between these two themes is actually Theme UI. All I did was just create, I created two colors basically that allowed me to switch between on a certain variable. So I can say, I'm gonna make a color mode called black, here are the colors. I'm gonna make a color mode called light, here are the colors. And then I can use a hook that Theme UI gives me to change between the color modes. And it just automatically applies to everything. I didn't have to touch any single component. So Theme UI is mostly meant for like theming things and creating design systems and reusability, whereas I feel like Tailwind is more for like getting this app to look good, like as fast as possible. So it's a little different as far as like how those two things work. I think Theme UI, and there's another tool that I'm going to talk about that's very similar to Theme UI. These tools are just like the next level on top of things like Tailwind, which I believe is the best CSS framework out there.
So this looks to be built on top of Emotion?
Yes.
Can you use the styled interface that Emotion has, exposes as well?
Yeah, you just have to import it like you normally do.
Sure.
Yep.
Thank you.
But you can absolutely use it. Yeah, it's definitely built on top of Emotion, and which is a very loved and very well used CSS and JavaScript mechanism for React. All right, let's continue to make our app look good. So the next thing is let's get our index page looking good. So you can just copy and paste this to the index page. And again, if you don't feel like copying and pasting this, you can just check out to the branch, right? There's a lot going on, but I'm just gonna do it. Cool, so here's one little break. I talked about variants before, so here's an example of that. So I'm able to use this word variant, which points to something that I defined in theme UI. So you can see I'm saying I want this variant to point to containers.page. Well, if I go to theme, I have containers and I have page. So basically take these styles and apply it here. That way I don't have to write them all. So you can imagine you could get rid of all these inline styles, everything that's inline, and just mask them behind variants. And then you're done. You just go add variants to all your JSX elements. And then all you ever have to do is just change them here. That's it. You're done. You never have to touch JSX again for style unless you're changing a variant name. That's all you got to do. Very simple. I can't think of a simpler way to style this and make it look good. Yep, that's the variants. And then let's see. Then we'll go down to the notes index page. We got some stuff here, so we can copy this. Zoom out so I can copy it. Zoom out some more. There we go. Don't forget to copy that JSX pragma comment at the top of these codes. If you're following along, you got to copy that comment. Otherwise, it won't tell the compiler how to compile, and you won't get all the JSX SX properties and stuff like that. And then the last one is just the ID page. So let's copy that ID page. And we'll put, yeah, was that right? Yeah, there we go. ID page. And should be good to go there. And here's just an example of the root app. So we already added a theme provider, and now you can see I just added the nav component. So nobody got asked the question earlier. It's like, yeah, is this a good place to do a layout? Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing here. You can see I'm adding the nav component to the root here. So we can just copy that and add that to our underscore app like that. Boom. So now we got our nav, we have our theme, we got our page. Everything's themed up, ready to go. So now if I were to just save all of this stuff and go back to localhost, boom. Now you get a decent looking app, I guess. So yeah, we get something that looks more like an app now. And everything just worked. So yeah, this is where you should be at this point. And you're almost ready to go get funding for this note-taking app. So let me know if you want to talk to some investors. All right. The last thing I want to talk about with Theme UI is something that's very similar to it, which is Base Web. I've used Base Web once or twice, and it's the closest thing I can think of that's Theme UI. I think it's created by Uber, and they're very similar. They take a different approach, but the result is very similar, and they're also meant for theming and stuff like that. It's a very good framework. Highly recommend checking it out. It's very well maintained as well. Documentation is pretty good too. So you can check this out. It does a really good job of getting you there. And the other last thing is Theme UI also has built-in components that actually are really good. You can actually build an entire application just using their built-in components. I've done it. I've never had to make a custom component just using all of their stuff. So I highly recommend checking it out because they have everything from flex boxes to grids, buttons, cards, forms, you name it. They got all the basic stuff that you need. It's basically just divs styled with themes already that are already hooked up to variants. So all you gotta do is just change the variants in your theme object. So really cool. So yeah, highly recommend checking that out too. So we left off on Theme UI and how I style components in my React applications. Just to note that Theme UI is not specific to Next.js. It can work in pretty much any React environment. It works very well with Gatsby because I'm pretty sure Gatsby is the team behind Theme UI. So there's tons of integrations and plugins there. It works good with Create React app. It works good with React Static, which is another static rendering library for React, which is very popular. So it just works in React in general. And I think there might be plans to make it work in other places as well, like Vue and stuff like that. So yeah, Theme UI, pretty dope. Now we're going to talk about customizing Next.js and the configuration of it and stuff like that. So like I said, out of the box, Next.js has a really good experience, right? Because it handles a lot of things for us, like the Webpack, Babel, all the different rendering modes that we'll talk about, pretty much everything. But if you want to hook into that and change some of it, opt in, opt out, extend, do things like that, we actually have this next config.js file that you can put on the root of your project. And that allows you to hook into Next.js and pretty much you can pretty much do whatever you want there specific to Next.js, or not specific to Next.js. Things like changing Webpack, and this is where you would add support for Sass or stylus or less, or maybe there's an SVG loader for Webpack that you want to turn React SVG files into React components, something like that. Like literally everything you normally would have done, you would do it here. For like create React app, the equivalent would be, okay, create React app doesn't have the loader that I want, or it doesn't have it configured the way that I want. From there, I think you have to do like an eject. You have to eject the configuration yourself, and then you can modify it, and then you can no longer use create React app. Well, there's no eject feature here because you're always going to be using Next.js. You just can extend it by doing something like this. So to me, that's just a better experience than having to opt out of something. And that's because Next.js is a framework and not a set of built-in opinions that are managed by some scripts. It's a framework. So that's the difference. Other frameworks kind of do something similar. I know Next, which is a Vue version of Next.js. Basically, it's very inspired by Next.js. It's called Next. They do something very similar with their configuration file where you can just configure everything from that file. So pretty legit. And obviously Gatsby does something very similar as well. So yeah, like I said, you can create this config file, and basically there's a couple ways you can do it. So if we come down here, we can say next.config .js, and you can module.exports this object to like this, right? And you really don't have to do anything else. In fact, if I were to restart this, you can see first right there, it says found a change in the Next.js config. Restart the server to see the changes in effect. That means Next.js is looking for this file. Like it knows it exists. It's a special file name. So the name is very important. So I'm gonna restart the server here. And you'll see I get a warning. So warning, detected in Next.js, next config.js, but there was no exported configuration found. It's basically saying there's nothing here. I don't know if, and it's like, I don't know if you did that intentionally or not, but hey, there's nothing here. You should probably fill some stuff out, right? So there are a lot of different things we can do here. Like for instance, in my site here, the course curriculum, I'm talking about Webpack, and I'll just kind of do that here. So if you wanted to change some things about Webpack, like, I don't know, maybe there's like some really dope Webpack plugin that you wanted to do, you can add that here, because everything in this object is this same object that's on the Webpack config, except they're gonna merge it with theirs. So it's not gonna completely blow out theirs, what they have. It's just gonna merge the two. So you can, and I'm pretty sure it uses a package called Webpack merge that merges Webpack config smartly. So you can add whatever you want here. So for instance, if you had some plugins that you wanted to add it, new my Webpack plugin, right? You can do that. And this is how you can add functionality to it. So for all my Webpack people that love getting crazy, you can still do it. You can do it here and not have to opt out of everything that they give you. Pretty legit. So that's one way. The other way is that gives you just a little bit more power, is you can return a function. And this function has two arguments. You get what's called the phase. And then you get this object here that has a property on it called, I think it's called default config, maybe? I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. So the default config is literally the default configuration for your next config, the one that gets created for you if you don't make one. So with this, we have this phase here. This phase is going to be a string, and it's actually going to come from something called, let me see, I think it's like imports from Next.js, constants, yeah, next constants. And basically there's some phases in here, like, here we go. So you can see phase production build, phase production server, server prop, like different things like that. So I'm gonna say phase production build. And basically I can do something like this. I can say if phase triple equals phase production build. Basically what this means is if I'm in the production build, if I'm running a production build inside of Next.js, run this code. So this allows me to change the configuration depending on what Next.js is doing. So a better example would be, let's look at phase development build and see how that goes. So I'm pretty sure That one is phase development server or something like that. So we can say phase equals phase development server, and then we can do something like this, console.log. I'm in dev mode here. And you can return an object here, which will be your config. But for now, I'm just going to return the default config, and then I'll also return the default config down here, right? So we can do that. And then when we start this, oh yeah, I forgot you can't do this. This config file doesn't get compiled by Babel, so you can't do like imports and stuff like that. So we got to go back to common.js and use some good old requires. There we go. So we require that. And you can see right here, I'm in dev mode, right? So you can see I'm in dev mode again. That's because it loaded up a bundle, right? There's two, this is a full stack app. So we have like a server side build and we have like a client side build. And this was the dev mode for both of them. So load up that twice. And yeah, it's pretty powerful. So you can do some pretty interesting stuff here. And this is just one use case of like what you can do. So yeah, pretty interesting convention. Wow, I did not mean to close that. Let me open that back up. There we go. Okay. All right. And then yeah, I added a link here that links to like all the different phases. It's not documented in their docs, at least not where I could find. But if you just go look in their source code, you can find them here. So all different types of stuff, these 4 phases here. So we got export, we'll talk about export. Production build, I talked about that. Production server is when it's live running on a server in production, and development server is when you run Next by itself. So yeah, pretty nice here. I'm a big fan of just looking at source code. I go look at source code, I think, more than I do documentation. So it's just, I prefer it sometimes. So yeah, I do that. Any questions on that, on the config?
Do you have to modify the default config, or do you just return a config object?
Good question. So I usually don't modify arguments, right? I try to keep things mutable because you might cause side effects. And especially because I'm pretty sure they do the merging for you. So I think it's safe to do something like this if you're gonna do some modifications, is you can just spread over the default config and then you can make your mods here. So whatever your mods are, you can make them here. So if you were gonna do something like Webpack, then you would do your Webpack stuff here, right? So you just spread over the default config before in this brand new object, and then you do your stuff here. And I think that's a little safer than trying to modify this thing, which, yeah, I would stray away from modifying arguments in JavaScript in general. I would always steer away from that, especially objects and things like that. Plugins. All right, so because the Next.js config file is dead simple and it has a convention, usually when there's conventions, there's also going to be plugins, right? Conventions usually equals plugins because if there's a set of rules that everyone has to follow, that means it's predictable. And if it's predictable, you can create common logic, and plugins are just common logic. It's just like, oh, a lot of people just use this anyway, so we'll just make a plugin, right? So Next.js has plugins, but honestly, they don't even feel like plugins. They're just like extended configurations. They call them plugins. It doesn't even feel like they had to make it. It was so free that it was just like, yeah, it's like they didn't really make a plugin system. It was just the way that you configure your Next.js, your next config file makes it so that plugins are possible. But I don't think they went and designed a plugin system because it's very, very simple. But basically, it kind of looks like this. The convention is, most of the time, you'll see something like this, like with, and then the name of the plugin. So kind of like a higher order component. So with offline, with SaaS, with less, things like that. And that's kind of how you would use the plugin. And all you really do for most of the time is you kind of just wrap the configuration that you have with the plugin. Because what most plugins do is that they might take in some options. So with offline might take in some options as the first arguments like this. Let me just demonstrate. So if I had a plugin like with offline, or let's say this, with my plugin. All right, let's just say we have that. And then what I'll do is, let me get rid of this right quick, and I'll make my config here. So this will be my next config here. Object right here. And then what I'll do is I'll have, let's say I have a plugin called with my plugin. Sometimes this plugin might take some arguments for the plugin. So the args for the plugin go first. And then it's usually almost always your next config goes here. If your plugin doesn't take any arguments, it's usually just the next config. And the reason that happens is because at the end of the day, you have to return a config object inside of this file. So if you're using a plugin, then you pass your config object to the plugin and the plugin just returns it for you. So that's usually the convention, and that's why it works that way. And that is actually really useful because it allows you to basically create like this system of plugins consuming plugins, right? Kind of like middleware in Express. So if you ever use Express, it's very similar to that. And that's exactly what we're gonna do now. So there's this really cool plugin called With Plugins that allows you to compose plugins together a lot easier than if you did it yourself. And that's actually what we're gonna do now. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a plugin that allows us to easily add environment variables to our Next app. So without this plugin, the way you would have to add environment variables will look like this with Next.js. So if I have this config, I would say module.exports equals this object. I can say env, and I can put, my env here, and I can put whatever value I want. It's pretty simple. This works very fine. You might even ask yourself, why do I need a plugin? Because everything you have here is going to be injected into your code. So that means I'm able to use process.env. whatever env I want, and it's going to give me the value. And if you ever use this plugin in Webpack, what actually happens is when this file gets processed, it's going to replace this whole value, right, this whole statement with the actual value. So as far as the browser is concerned, this is going to get replaced with whatever the value was. So it's never going to see process.env. It's never going to see that. This thing gets completely replaced. So it's not the same thing as using process.env in a node environment, which actually reads from the environment. This is just a simple replacement. It's just replacing it as far as from the browser's perspective. So yeah, like I said, you might be asking like, well, why do we even need a plugin? This is actually pretty simple. Well, it's because if this was a secret, you're not just going to put this in here like this, right? You're not just going to just hard code your secret API key here and then check it in the Git. Like you just wouldn't do that. I hope you're not. So most likely you'll have like a .env file. So we actually have one right here. So you should have a .env file in your repo. If you don't, you can make one. It's literally just a file on the root called .env. And I have one, and the syntax for the env file kind of goes as this. You put the name of the variable that you want, and most environment variables are all caps, and they use underscores what's that called? Snake case, like caps, snake case or something like, oh, it's not snake case. Is it snake case? I don't know. So it'll do all caps like that, followed by the equal sign, and then whatever value you want for that environment variable. That's typically how a .env file works, and you can put more on the next line if you want, like that. All right, so that's how .env files work. And then what you want to do is you make sure this file doesn't get checked into GitHub, right? So this file is not checked into GitHub, and you're good to go. So now you can safely put your secrets in here. And then inside of here, you need to load up that .env and put it here. And that can be pretty manual. So there's a plugin that kind of helps us with that. And that's what we're going to install. So in order to get this to work, we need to install two dependencies. We're going to install Next.env, and then we're going to install .env-load. So if you got npm, you can copy that script. If you have yarn, you can copy that. I'm using yarn, so I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to add that. And actually, you should just install this as a dev dependency because it's only going to be used for building. So definitely safe to do dev there. And once you have it, then all we're going to do is just load up this plugin. So it's actually pretty simple. All we have to do is require, like Next env equals require next env, and then dot env load equals require dot env load. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say dot env load like this. And what this does is it's just going to look for an env file in your folder, grab every environment variable in there, and inject it into the environment for you. So you don't have to do anything. And then from there, all we're going to do is just use this next env plugin like that. And that's going to allow us, oh, I'm sorry, you call the plugin, I got it backwards. So you would have to do it that way. So what we'll do is we'll say with next env equals next env. Oops. There we go, next env. And then that, we can use that plugin right here with env. So what this is going to do is it's going to look at the env file, load up all the environment variables in the environment, inject them. This right here is actually creating the plugin with the environments loaded into it automatically. So in the background, you can imagine there's going to be a config that looks something like this. So there's going to be a config, a next config that has like env on it, just like we had before. And then every variable that's here, so in this case, this help app URL is going to be here with the actual value. Like that, right? So all that is being done for us with these plugins and the combination of that load. So that's just for free. So now we get to do that. Pretty free, pretty easy way to load your stuff up for development. And yeah, I have a warning here. Don't check that into Git. Please, if you never use .env files, please don't check them into Git. That's the whole point. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll just update. We'll use this environment variable somewhere. So I'm just using it as an anchor tag inside of the nav component. So we'll just do that. And I'm just going to copy this. And I'm going to go into our nav component here. And I'm just going to add that anchor tag after the link and fix that formatting. And some more indents. There we go. And basically, it's just a link to like an external help app desk or something that you have for your customers on your Note app. That's it, just to demonstrate how this will work. So remember, this gets completely replaced with a string as far as the browser is concerned. So we got that. I might have to start the app again. There we go. And you can see I'm still getting, you have no exported configuration. That's because I did not put a configuration here, right? So I don't have an export, so I'm totally fine with that warning. I have nothing to export there, so it's totally fine. Go back here, and then now you can see I have this help thing here that points to front-end masters, right? So whatever URL that you put in that env file is what's going to be there. And like I said, you can do all different types of stuff with these plugins. Very legit, very simple to work with. Any questions on plugins and configuration with the next config file?
Yeah, is there a place like in the documentation that lists all the plugins that you can use, or do you just, how do you find them?
Yeah, so there are official ones, and I'll show you those right now. And then most of them are just like any other plugins, they're community plugins. So everyone has their own thing. But if you go to Versal Next plugins, here's all the official ones that they maintain and that they have. And then here are some notable community ones. But I'm sure you'll find dozens of more that aren't even on this list. And the other thing is that Next.js has recently released a new version, 9.3. And these new versions have actually changed how some of these plugins work and stuff like that. So just be careful about when the last time one of these plugins was updated. Make sure it was, updated the last couple months, because if it's like a plugin from 2 years ago, it might not work with how Next works now. So just be careful of that. But yeah, they got some pretty good plugins here, like Preact. If you're anti-Facebook, but you like React, then Preact might be the way to go. It's a drop-in replacement, things like that. TypeScript, which actually you don't need anymore because TypeScript is supported from Next.js out of the box, which is actually, I'm about to show you how that works. So yeah, stuff like that. So yeah, pretty good. Some really nice plugins out there, but at the end of the day, most of them just kind of modify the Webpack config. At the end of the day, they take some Webpack logic, wrap it in a Next.js configurable plugin, and boom, there you go. most of them, that's what they do. So before we move on to API routes, I want to talk about TypeScript support. So if you want to use TypeScript with Next.js, they made it super easy to do. All you have to do is make a .ts config, or is it what ts dot conf, what is it? ts config dot JSON? Yeah, okay. JSON. I can't remember. Yeah, there we go. That's all you got to do. And then from there, I think if you just start this, oops. Right here, you can see, hey, looks like you're trying to use TypeScript but don't have a required package installed. So it just by adding that file, it detected that I'm trying to use TypeScript. And it's trying to like automate some stuff for me, but it needs me to install some packages. So if I just installed, and then it looks like it even detected that I was using Yarn, which is really impressive. I think if you're using NPM, it might say NPM here instead. So I'm gonna just install that because I do like TypeScript. I prefer TypeScript. And then now if I run yarn dev, look at that. So it says, we detected TypeScript in your project and created a tsconfig JSON file for you. Like, wait, what? What do you mean? So if I go look at this tsconfig, boom, they just populated it with everything I need for TypeScript. I didn't have to do anything. Like that to me is pretty amazing because for the longest when I was kind of like on the fence about TypeScript, one of the biggest things for me was always configuring this file. Like, wait, how do I configure this thing? And what's the difference between this target and this lib versus Babel's target and lib versus Webpack's target and lib? Like, I don't understand. So I always kind of just avoided it and would just go copy and paste someone else's. And now I do understand it, so it's not so intimidating. But still, this is very nice, and it's ensured to work very well with Next. So if I were to change one of these to TSX, I guess, you can see it's already breaking because TypeScript doesn't know anything about this SX, right? So it's already working, it's already breaking. So this will obviously fail if I try to run this. Let's see. Oh, I guess they just ignore those TypeScript errors. That's really cool. There we go. So yeah, it still works with TypeScript out of the box, really good to go. So pretty nice, can't argue with that. That's the easiest TypeScript setup I've ever seen. Find me a better one. I'll wait. I'll wait for you. Let me know, because I haven't. That's pretty legit. In fact, I don't know why everyone doesn't do that. Like, ridiculous. API routes. This is where it gets crazy. Like, what is this Next.js thing? Like, yeah, it gets crazy. This is where it flexes a little bit. It just kind of shows off. So yeah, API routes, we talked about a little bit, but yeah, Next.js is a full stack framework. So full stack, as in it has a server too. And I'm not just talking about like the server it uses for development. No, it's a Webpack dev server. I'm not also talking about like the server it uses to render your pages, because yeah, it does have that, but I'm literally talking about you can make an API and serve data right next to your code, like a monolith, basically. And it does it in a way to where you don't have to worry about which framework you're going to use on the server. So not only does it help you get started on the front end to build things faster using something like React, it actually helps you get started on the back end by just creating handlers. You don't have to create routes. You don't have to create anything. You just make the handlers, which, you know, you can think of them as the components of the back end, right? So it's really beautiful how it works, actually. And you probably already know how it works because we've been doing it this whole time. So if you want to make API routes in Next, which I do recommend doing if you have an API that's only going to be used by the app that you're making in Next.js, you should just put it there. All you have to do is head over to your pages like this. You make a new folder inside of the pages and you call it API. That's it. So now everything that you put inside, I didn't know, look at that folder. What is that? Is that supposed to be an API? What is that? I don't know. It looks like, it reminds me of like the green slime from Nickelodeon back in the day. That's what it reminds me of. So anything we put inside of the API is going to be a route to an endpoint that we can hit on our API. Very similar to the way that we added pages inside of pages. So again, this also hints at that you can't name anything whatever you like. You can't just put whatever name you want inside the pages. So we know we can't use _app for a page. And now we're learning we can't use API for a page. So if you have an actual page called API, this isn't going to work for you. I'm pretty sure you can change this configuration in the next config, but I would maybe just change a route and put it in a sub path somewhere, so that way it doesn't conflict with this. Because I think if the API is not on the root of pages, it's fine. Like if you put API inside of notes, I think you're good to go there. But putting it here, it's going to treat it as an API. So that's how that works. And then as far as like how does the routing work? The exact same way as pages, the exact same syntax. So for instance, if I want to make a route to the index of my API, guess what I would have to make? Index.js. And now I can go to /API and do a request there once I actually fill this out. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If I want to make some subpaths here, like for instance, I know for our note-taking gap, I think I have it listed down here. Or is that next? Yeah, I think that's next. Yeah, we'll get there. So for like our note-taking app, we're gonna have like /notes and stuff like that. It's the same thing. So if I have, user, and then I want to be able to get all the users, so I'll make an index for that. And then maybe I just want to get one user by an ID. So I'll say, give me the ID of that user. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the routes. And they even have the catch-all routes too. So everything's exactly the same. But this allows us to do an API routing. So pretty powerful. And that's how you create the routes. And when you start it up, you're going to get those routes as well. All right, now let's get into actually making some of these things, do some stuff. So, tip. This is a big tip. Next.js API routes are not the same as Vercel's serverless API functions, although the setup is very similar. So if you use Vercel, who are the creators of Next.js, and you want to use their serverless functions, which are really good, the way that you make those serverless functions look almost similar to what you're doing here. The biggest difference is for the serverless functions, by default, the API folder is on the root of your app. And you have to add a configuration file that tells serverless functions how to map your functions to different events in the serverless environment. So don't confuse these API routes with the API service functions, because these API routes are not service. These are not service functions. These are absolutely not service functions. If you want service functions, you can do that with Vercel, but it has nothing to do with Next.js. You can add them to your Next.js app, but they're completely independent of Next.js. They just look the same. And I remember when I was first using this a long time ago, I got confused. So that's why I put that tip there. I was like, wait, are these serverless, or how does this work? They're not the same. So don't confuse the two. This has nothing to do with serverless or Vercel, whereas serverless routes down here that you might make are completely dealing with Vercel and serverless functions and nothing to do with Next.js. I think they just thought that it was a good convention to make an API folder since it works so well in Next.js. Hey, why not use it for serverless functions as well? And I don't blame them. It's a really good convention. So really cool. All right, so let's talk about handlers. So if you've never built an Express app with Node, no worries. You can take this course here for Express and APIs with Node right here in Front End Masters that basically walks you through how to create APIs with Express and Node. If you haven't, not a big deal. It's actually really intuitive, at least for what we're going to cover today. But at the end of the day, that's kind of what Next.js does. It basically gives you the Connect, which is this framework that Express made popular. If you've ever used Express and you have the middleware and all that stuff, there's actually something called Connect. Express just used to rely on it as a dependency, and then I think maybe 4.0, 3.0, somewhere in Express, they decided to get rid of it as a dependency, but they still kept the same syntax. But everything was from Connect back in the day, like 8 years ago or something like that. Most node servers you see are kind of based off that. And Next.js is no different. So all you have to do in the files is do something like this. By doing this, we literally get an API, right? So for instance, I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to add it to, I'm going to just delete this user thing, and I'm going to add it to our API here. And that's it. I have an API now to /API. You notice there are no methods here, so I don't know if I'm doing a git, put, patch, delete. I don't know what I'm doing because I'm not doing, either of those things. I'm doing all of those things. So we can test this out. So I'm just gonna restart right quick. Actually, let me get rid of this log for the theme that's kind of like making our output super noisy. I always like to log my themes sometimes because if I'll do presets and I don't know what the colors are or what they're called. So I'll log it out so I can see the colors and the sizes and the fonts and everything so I can use them. So I usually keep that on for development. All right, so let's hit the API. I'm actually, you know what, I'm just gonna do a GET request. So I'll just do a GET request here and it's going to be to our app, which for me is localhost 3000. If you didn't change your port, it's the same thing, /API. I'm just gonna hit enter here and then boom, I get back message hello, right? If mine looks different than yours, that's because I have like some JSON Chrome extension that makes this look like this. If you don't have the Chrome extension, you're just gonna get back some black text on a white screen, but it's still JSON. So yeah, pretty simple. We got a nice full API. I mean, can someone, again, show me a framework that makes it easier to do this? Like this is the simplest API I've ever seen done ever. Like you didn't have to do anything and it just worked. All you had to do was just make a file. I didn't even have to make a route, it just worked. And that to me is just really impressive. So I really like what they're doing here with this. So let's keep it moving. And so now, yeah, that's really cool and all, but I mean, who wants to do all this stuff for all the complicated server logic they're gonna have? Like we need a little more than this. Like, we need something a little closer to Express. And out of the box, Next.js doesn't give you that experience, but I think that's a good thing because it is just based off Connect, you can literally use whatever you want. And there's a lot of packages out there to kind of make this easier, but I've landed on one and we'll kind of talk about that. But basically, some of the things that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to respond to, you know, a URL like this, but be able to split off the methods, like whether it's a get, a put, a delete. Because right now, I can make any request I want to this with any method, and it's always going to return the same. It doesn't matter, right? I can test this out right now. So now I'm gonna use HTTP PI, which is like curl for humans, to test the non-GET request because a browser can only test a GET request. So if I want to like test a post, I can say HTTP, which is the command line for HTTP PI. That's so hard to say. And then I can say put, and I'm just gonna say 3000. This is a shortcut for localhost 3000, and then /API, which is where our API is, and then I can do that. And you can see I still get back message hello. I can do the same thing with post. I get back message hello. I mean, I can go on and on. Delete, doesn't matter. It's always gonna send it back, and that's because I'm not doing anything with the methods here. So yeah, you could just split on the methods by using, you know, request.method equals get, do this, request.method equals delete, do this. But that's really gross, and Express already solved this, so why can't we use that here? So let's do that. So here's a plugin that I like to use, or a module. It's called Next.Connect. That basically allows you to do it. So you can turn any handler into an Express-like router that has its own methods on it, and also be able to use any Connect-based middleware. So for this case, I'm using cores. So that works. And then you just export your handler. So I'm just going to install Next.Connect here, like that. And then what we can do is we can import this up top. So import, I'm just gonna call it NC from Next.Connect. And then what I can do is I can make a handler like this, which is NC. And then it's just chainable. So now I can say, oh, I wanna be able to get. And then I can say rec, res. So if you never use Express, rec and res are short for request and response. So here's the incoming request, and here's how you respond to it. So that's what that means. I can also do something like post and rec and res. And the other thing to note about this is that you can do async functions in here, right? So if this stuff needs to be async because you're doing some database stuff, no problem. They can be async. You can do all the stuff you heard. They can do promises. It's all good. So we have this GET request here. So now I'll just say like rec.json, and I'll send back a message that says, okay. And then I'll do the same thing for post. That just says posted, like that. Okay, so then I think I don't have to restart it. I think that was good to go. So now let's test Well, see what happens if I try to do a delete. Not found. Can't do a delete anymore because we didn't create a method for that inside that NC handler. So now it's a 404. But if I go back and I try to do, what do I do? Post? Yeah. Post here. Res.json is, oh, I put rec, sorry. Res.json and res.json. If I do a post here, boom, I get the posted message. And then obviously if I go back to the browser and I do that, I get the get message for okay. All right, so that to me is, I mean, extremely powerful. It kind of reminds me of a service function. If you've ever used service functions before, it kind of feels that way, except for it's not a service function. It's just not a service function. It's on Express. So this was pretty legit. I mean, you could really get an app moving really quick, really fast with this. And again, this code is not living. It's right? It's right next to your pages, which are client-side React components. But this code never gets shipped to the browser, right? This is never going to be in the browser. This is only server-side. It's a completely different bundle. So even though it lives there, it's separate. And to me, logically working on it as a developer, it just makes more sense than what I currently have set up in different places of our organization, where it's just like, you got this API over here, it's in this repo and this thing, and maybe you're using Docker, it's a lot. This kind of just simplifies it a lot, in my opinion. So mono repos were always legit. Microservices just changed it all, but you can still have a mono repo with microservices. You just have, like, what is it? Like Yarn workspaces, or, using Learner or something like that. So you can still do that, especially if they're all Node. So just having the code next to each other just works better, in my opinion. So we head back over to the stuff here. Here are the routes that we have to make. So basically, it's just basic CRUD, right? We need to be able to create a note. So it'll be a post to /API/note. We need to be able to update a note. So it'll be a patch to, API/note/ID. We need to be able to delete. So it'll be the same thing. Looks like I left delete on all of these. So we need to delete here, which will delete the note. We need to be able to get one note. That'll be a get request. We need to be able to get all notes, which will be a get request without the ID. So we'll make all of these. And if you take a look, we really only have two URLs. We have this URL, which is API/note. And then we have this URL, which is API/note/ID. That's it. They're all just different methods with the same URL. So we only need to make two files. We need to make one file for API/note, and then one file for API/note/ID. That's it. Just two files, different methods. And we know that we have that. We have the next connect that allows us to do different methods in the same file. So that's what we'll do. So we go to API. I'm going to create a new folder here for notes. And then I'm going to make an index here for that file. And then I'm going to make one for the ID of note, which will be id.js. And boom, we got our two files for that. And then if you want, you can follow along and you can copy this up. I'll probably just write this stuff out by hand. Some helper functions here I might copy. But the one thing is, we're not going to get into databases and stuff for this course. I think it would just be a distraction. So we're just going to do some stuff in memory right now, so at least we get some real data. So what you can do is you can just copy this file right here, and you can add it to a file called source/data/data.js. And I'm going to do that. So source, make a new folder called data, and inside of there is add a data.js. Like that. And I'm just going to paste that in. Literally just in-memory array of notes. Nothing flashy here. It is important though, you got to do a module.exports. Don't do the ES6 export, otherwise it won't persist. It won't be like a live object. So do the module.exports. Cool. So then now let's go ahead and build out these handlers here. So I'll import NC from Next Connect, and then I'll make a handler. And then I'll just export defaults, that handler. And then I know I'm going to need the notes in here, so I'll just import the notes from, where is it at? Source, there we go. So source, data, like that. So I got my notes. Okay, cool. So if we're in the index file, if we go back, we know we need to do a post to create a new notes. And then we need to, this says delete, but it should be get. We need to do a get to get all notes. So we'll just do that. So we'll say this will be a post. This will be to create the notes. So request responser. And then we need a get to get all the notes. So if we want to create a note, we'll just assume whatever's on the body is what's going to be the note. We're not going to be too strict. So I'll just say a note is whatever is on request.body. If you've never used Express before, in this case, because there's some middleware that's being used, whatever is on the incoming request.body is whatever they posted to the server in the body field or the data field or whatever library you're using on the front end. So we direct.body, and then I'll need to add an ID. Let's use date. Date.now is good for ID. And then I'll just say notes.push into our database of notes like that. And then I'll just say res.json data note. So I'll send back that note. And then boom, we just created a note. Very simple there. And the next thing is I want to get all the notes. So this one's very simple. I can just say res.json data and just put notes. And then we got all the notes, okay? So we can go try this out and see what happens. So if I go back here to HTTP py, I can say HTTP, I can say post, and then I could say, actually, what's the best way? Actually, the best way to do, there's so many ways to do JSON on here. I think this is better for me. So I'll just say echo like this, and I can add some JSON. So I'll say echo, and then I'll put some, let's see, I'll put a name on the to-do, or the note, maybe a title. Let's say a title. I'll say this is the title, and then I can pipe this to HTTP like this. If you have any other API client like Insomnia, or is it Insomnia? Yeah, Insomnia, Postman, they all work. I just like to do it from the CLI. You can even use curl. I just don't know how to use curl. So I'm using HTTP py. So I'm gonna post to 3000 /API/note. And boom, we get back the note that we created, just like that. It works very well. And then I should be able to get all notes, right? So I should be able to say, cool, then just give me all the notes. And then boom, we get back an array of all the notes, which is just one that I created, right? So if I create some more, then I go back and get them all, they'll all be there. All right, very simple, super simple API, works like magic, pretty amazing. I love it. The next ones we want to do is we'll be able to do the update, the delete, and then the get one. And that's all going to be in the ID because we need an ID to update, we need an ID to delete, and we need an ID to get one. So we'll just do the same thing. I'm just going to copy most of this, bring it over here. And then for we're going to have a patch instead of a post. And that's going to get one. But I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy some of this code down here because I have, actually I'm just going to copy all this because I forgot. I got some stuff in here that like handles the nuances of checking those IDs. Wow, this file is big. Let me zoom out. This one's pretty much the same. The reason I copied it is because there's like some logic in here with like the dates. When they get sent up in the string, in the URL parameter are actually strings, whereas they're saved in the database as numbers. So the equality check doesn't work until you parse int. So that's where that is. But as you can see, to get one, and here's what I really wanted to show you. Does this look familiar? Request.query.id. Let's take a look at this page for ID in a JSX file. Look at that. There's a query property here where we also got the ID. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. So if you go here, you also get this query. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you used Express, typically you would get the ID from rec.params because it's a parameter in the URL and not a query string. And that's where you would get it from. But in this case, it's going to be on the query object. There's not actually going to be a params object inside of here. So that's a big difference. If you try to do params, it would just be like it's undefined. So it's actually on the query. And that's the exact same thing on the front end, which is also the query. And the parameters will be in there. And they'll be the exact same format as they are on the front end. So if you had a catch-all, this will be an array of parameters. It'll be the same thing. So I think that uniformity and that convention is just nailing it home. I think that's pretty dope. So anyway, yeah, I get the note. On the GET request, if it's not a note, I'll 404. If it is, I send it back. For patch, I do the same thing. I just merge. I merge whatever you sent up, and then I send it back. And then for delete, I literally just splice it out of memory. That's it. Nothing crazy here. So now we're able to do some CRUD stuff on here. So if I take this ID here like this, I should be able to say, give me that. And looks like that broke because resolver is not a function. What? I don't have a resolver in here. Let's see. Looks like some internal thing that broke because of something I did. Let's just restart it and see what happens. All right, so now let's try to run this again. So if I do a GET request to this, okay, I get the same. Oh wait, no, I get a not found this time. Okay, so obviously this is not gonna be found because I just restarted the server and I deleted every node in memory. So there's not gonna be any here, right? So I would have to create some more like that and like that, maybe grab that ID like that. And then now I should be able to do this and then boom, there we go. So I was able to get that one to do. If I wanted to delete it, I could do this. I could say delete that single note and you can see it deleted it. And then the last one is an update, which kind of looks like this. So I can take this ID here and then I can do this, change this to a patch, put this ID here, and then just offer an update like new title. And then boom, new title, right? So super easy, CRUD, REST app, out of the gate, didn't have to do anything but make some files. Very simple, very easy, works very well, deploys very easily. Yeah. Any questions on that? Is anyone not impressed with Next.js yet? Like this thing is, I don't know, it's crazy. I'm just like thinking about like when they sat down and made this, is this what they thought it was going to be, or did it just like turn into it? Because like when I make open source, I'll have an idea about something and I'll make it, and halfway through I'm like, wait, no, this can do a lot more, and then like it'll just like go into something else, and then I never finish it. But like I don't know, I'm always just curious like how people come up with this stuff. Like usually if it's something good, that person or that team experienced a lot of pain before they did it. It's so much pain that they spent so much time making this because that's how much pain they felt. So I'm always just like, what did they have to go through to make something like this? Like, I feel bad for them, but thankfully they did it for us. So awesome. All right, here's my favorite part.
Oh, there's a question.
Yes.
Maybe you're going to get to it, but interacting with your API or consuming your API in pages.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get to that. I mean, technically right now, you already know how to do that, right? If you know how to fetch content inside of a React, if you know how to hit an API inside of a React component, then yeah, just hit your API. It's, in this case, it's localhost 3000/API. You can do that anywhere in your React components right now, and that'll be happening on the client. So I won't be covering that too much because I think we all know how to do that. But what I will cover in this next section is how to fetch data with Next.js's specific ways of fetching data and what they actually mean. I actually believe this next section is what defines Next.js. I think, you have the pages, and I think that gives Next.js some identity for sure, but other frameworks are kind of doing that too. But this next section is literally, I think, what defines Next.js, in my opinion. And I think it's one of the things they spend most of the time on getting right. And I think they nailed it. So you're going to see. But yeah, you can totally fetch those in your components right now. All right, this part's going to be a lot coming at you. It's a lot to understand here, but when you do, I think you'll really start to understand the power of Next.js. So let's talk about fetching data with Next.js. So there are many ways to fetch data, but it's all really going to depend on when the data is available, when do you need the data, and what you're going to do with it is going to determine how you fetch the data, because you're going to have a lot of options here. So if we just start with what you already know, which is what I was saying earlier, is that you can fetch data on the client side right now using any mechanism you already use in React. I mean, if you built a client-side React app before, how do you fetch data there? You can do the same thing, because once you're inside of React, you're inside of React. You have nothing to do with Next.js. Once the browser's running your code, it's the output of React. So you can do whatever you want there. Next.js doesn't change the behavior of how your components execute. It doesn't change that. So that's just React. So that doesn't change. So hooks, things like that still work. Speaking of that, I do recommend checking out something called SWR, which is also made by Versal and the Next.js team. It's a hook that does a lot of stuff for you when it comes to fetching data client side, and React Query pretty much does the same thing. They just do it slightly different. They're both really good libraries. Highly recommend checking them out for your client side data fetching needs. I don't use anything but either one of these. I don't know how I use anything before, because it kind of just changes everything. So check it out. And the other thing is that's really beautiful that Next.js gives us is automatically injects the fetch function into your environment, server side and on the client. So you don't have to worry about installing Axios or a fetch polyfill or isomorphic fetch. You don't have to do that. It injects it globally on the client and the browser. I'm sorry, on the client and the server. And if the browser doesn't have it, it polyfills it. So yeah, that's free. That's a global for you. You're ready. You're good to go. You can fetch data immediately. Just use fetch in any environment in Next.js. It just works. So that's really good. Cool. So now for fetching data ahead of time, because we talked about fetching data on the client side, right? That's fetching data at runtime in the client. Now, if you want to fetch data ahead of time, you got three different methods here. And we're going to talk about all these in as much detail as I can before we start getting to writing the code. And we will write the code, but we're just going to talk about it before we start doing it, because I really want you to understand it. So static data. All of these methods above here, so get static props, get static paths, and get server-side props. All of these are for pre-rendering pages only, right? So you're never going to use these methods when we get to them inside of a component. They're only meant for pages. So pages were not only there to help you create routes in the browser, but they actually have some significance to Next.js. I kind of hinted at it earlier when I said you can think of a page as its own app. And that's because it is, because it's code split. It's its own entry point. It's actually its own standalone app. It doesn't really rely on any of the other pages to survive. I mean, technically it could run, but yeah, it might rely on some routing conditionals and stuff there. But yeah, it's its own app. So these methods here are meant for pre-rendering pages only. And like I said, by default, Next.js pre-renders every single page. Every page gets pre-rendered no matter how you build it by default. No matter if you want data or not, it's going to pre-render it to HTML, which is a really, really big benefit. And that's why you see that little battery icon in the bottom right of your Next.js app when you go to it like that, a pre-rendered page. So it takes you there. So that happens for you automatically. Now, if you want to fetch data during that pre-render, this is where it kind of gets, you got to really decide. So the first one we're going to talk about is get static props on a page. So get static props. It basically looks like this. In any single page, so in this case, in this index page here, I have my page, it's got some JSX or whatever, and I'm exporting a function called get static props. And basically the way get static props works is you return an object with a props function, or I'm sorry, a props method, a props property. And whatever you put in that props, that's what's going to get injected into your page on the client side, right? So that's what's going to be here. So basically, you can do whatever you want here. This is an async function. It's only going to be executed in a node environment. It's never going to be executed in a browser. In fact, this function doesn't even get bundled with this code. So even though it's in the same file, it actually gets stripped out before the browser bundle gets built. So it doesn't even get shipped with the browser code, even though it's in the same file. So Next.js is doing some really heavy lifting here to optimize this experience, which I think is really cool. So yeah, this won't even get shipped, which I think is really dope. So basically, you can do whatever you want here. You can do all different types of things, pretty much whatever you want here to get whatever props you need. So in this case, maybe you wanted to, I don't know, this was a CMS and you wanted to get some content from a CMS to get the title and the hero and the CTA text and button colors, all that stuff. You can make a call to your CMS and inject the results into your props. This is very similar to Gatsby's data sourcing, right? So if you do Gatsby, you install like a source plugin and then that adds it to your content mesh graph. And then you can make a like static query in the Gatsby page and you can do stuff like that. It's the same way, but this is where I would say it's a lot easier with Next.js because there's no overhead. There's no GraphQL. There is no source plugin. It's just write a function that returns some props. That's it. You can do whatever you want here. We don't care. And it executes on node. So in my opinion, it's a lot easier to understand. But yeah, you do give up some things that Gatsby does give you. So yeah, pretty easy here. Basically, and here's a deep dive on it. The results of this function are basically saved into a JSON file. And then at runtime, when you navigate to this page, in this case, the index page of your app, that JSON file is then going to be, the results of that are going to be injected as the props into here, right? That's the hydration phase. That's what rehydration means. So I think that's really exciting. And you can look at that. If you go look at the output of your Next.js app, you'll see like a whole bunch of JSON files in there with data. It's this data that you're fetching server side. It gets saved as a JSON file and then it gets injected at runtime and then cached and stuff like that. So that's how it goes from server side to client side. And I think that's a really good technique because I've actually created server-side frameworks before. I helped create Angular Universal, and the way that we did it was not that. So I think this is a much better way than what we did. So I give them props for that. This function and all other data fetching functions that we're going to talk about, like I said, will only ever run on the server. So if you're not, thinking there yet, that literally means you can do whatever you would normally do on the server in here. So file system work. You want to read the file system? Cool. You can access process.current working directory inside of here. You can access the file system. You can do whatever you want inside of here. Connect to the DB. Crawl a website. Literally anything you want to do on the server, you can do in this function that's in the same file as your component. So that, to me, is really powerful because you have all the mechanism, all the logic that this page depends on for whatever data is living right next to it. So super powerful, and it only ever runs on the server. So I really like that. The other thing is that function is going to receive a context object. So let me just go through that right quick. So we'll just do some stuff. Let me open, I'll go inside this index file right here, and I'll say export function get static props, like that. And then you're going to get this context object like this. And I'll just console.log this so you can see what I'm talking about. And I just need to satisfy, oops. There we go. I just need to satisfy the return constraints here. So I'll put props, and I'm not going to pass any props. So just by doing that, I automatically get some extra functionality. So I'm just going to yarn dev that. And then now I'm going to, you can see nothing really logged here. So I'm going to go here, refresh this. And when I actually went to the page, that's when it actually logged. So let's talk about that for a little bit. The reason it didn't log when I built it is because we're in dev mode and it's using server-side rendering during dev mode. Server-side rendering, which we'll really talk about in detail soon, renders when you hit the request. When you go to that route, then it computes. It only computes when you do a request to the route. It doesn't compute ahead of time. So it's a little different than like static rendering, which renders at build time. So that's why that didn't log until we actually went to the URL. And you can see right here, the context object is actually just an empty object. There's literally nothing here. And the reason it logged twice is I hit like a refresh. And that's because there's nothing to put here. The context object in the case of get static props only really contains one important thing. The other things are new features with Next.js that I probably won't be talking about, which is like their preview feature. But the one that's really important is going to be the params. But I don't have any params in this file. It's just an index file. There are no params in this URL, so there are no params here. So there's no way I can get them. And at the same time, because this is executed on the server and it will be executed at build time, you won't actually have access to the params because the params didn't happen yet. You weren't even in the browser yet. Like if you're running this and you're building for production and this thing is being statically built, because Next.js will run this function at build time when you go to production, you haven't even gotten params yet. This hasn't even been in the browser, just on your machine. So where did the params come from? How do they get here? Well, that leads us to the next function inside of fetching data with Next.js. Now, if we do have a dynamic URL in which we do need the value of the params in order to fetch the content for our page inside of get static props, then we're going to use another function called get static paths. Get static paths is very much like get static props, but its responsibility is to fetch all the generated paths for all your unique URLs. For instance, let's say we had a blog or a documentation website, which is really good. So we have a documentation website, but we have a catch-all URL in here, right? So let's say we did something like this, where it was like docs, and then inside of docs, it was like some catch-all here, like params, right? And we need a way to tell, we want to generate all the documentation pages ahead of time. We want this to be a static site. So that means we need to generate them at build time. So how do we know where they are? So eventually we got to pull this information down from somewhere, whether it's an API, whether it's a JSON file you got saved somewhere, whether it's a directory inside your app that says, here's all my markdown files and everything's marked down, right? No matter where it is, you need to figure out where it is and you need to create some paths. And that's what get static paths is. It's an ability to get the paths for static pages that need to be generated. That's why it's called get static paths. What are all the paths that you need for this dynamic URL to be statically generated? And it's really cool. So basically the way it works is just like get static props, it's an async function. You can do literally whatever you want in here, but at the end of the day, you need to return an object with paths on it, okay? And that object's gonna look like this. I'm sorry, an object with paths on it. And the paths is gonna be an array. And the array is just gonna have, for every single page that you wanna render, just send back the params. So in this case, I have a URL called slug, right? So I'm trying to go to slug here like that. So this will be my parameter. Then I just need to send back params with the slug and the value in it, like that. And this is going to tell Next.js, hey, you want to create 2 pages, one with this slug, one with this slug, and they both, resolve to this URL. That's what, and then Next.js will create those 2 pages. So you could think of it as like in Gatsby, where you would source markdown files to create pages. Or in Gatsby, they also source the pages directory to create pages. It's pretty much the same thing, except for you're hinting at the tool that says, hey, here are the pages that you won't be able to read because, they're not associated with pages. They're somewhere else. They're on my database. They're in this other folder. They're in this JSON file. So here they are. And then here's how you associate them. So that's what this does. So this will create those pages. And then now that once you have the paths here, you have the props here, what you can do is you can now use that params object. You can use that params object now, which is going to allow you to get the slug in this case, and boom, there you go. You can fetch your data over your slug. So we're going to be doing all of this. I just wanted to walk you guys through it. But yeah, that's how get static paths works with get static props. In fact, if you use get static paths, you have to use get static props. Why else would you use get static paths? So yeah, you have to use them both together. But you only have to use get static props if it's not a dynamic URL. If it's not a dynamic URL, you don't need get static paths. If it is a dynamic URL, then yeah, you should get static paths to get the actual pages you need to render for this. Now, not every dynamic URL is going to be able to be rendered ahead of time. Like for instance, if this is /user/user ID, I'm not going to go render a page for all millions of my users ahead of time. That's ridiculous. I mean, I guess you could, but I don't know why you would. And especially if all that data is dynamic. So you wouldn't do that here. We'll talk about what you would do instead. So this is not the case. This is for static pages, pages that are static, not dynamic pages. Dynamic pages, you can continue to do client side like you've been doing, or you can do this next thing, which I'm about to show you. And I'll talk a little bit more about static paths. One big tip here that they added recently was the ability to use fallback true, which I think is really cool. So if you add fallback true to this object inside the get static paths, this is really cool actually. What it does is it basically allows you to, let's say you have you're trying to render a blog that has 20,000 blog pages statically, but it just takes too long to build. So you're only going to render 100, the 100 most recent ones. And then for the rest, you can put fallback true. And then what it'll do is at runtime, when someone navigates to it, then it'll render it and pre-render it there. So it'll keep pre-rendering pages as people navigate to them instead of doing them ahead of time, which I think is really, really cool. And then you can tie into the fallback logic inside your page component. There's like a prop that gets passed in that says, hey, am I currently on a fallback right now? Yeah, and then you can show like a loading screen or something like that while it renders. So it's really cool, but really advanced, which is why I'm not gonna talk about it. But yeah, if you need something like that, look into that. But you literally only need this if you are building a lot of pages, which most people aren't right now. So yeah. Now we're going to talk about get server-side props. So get server-side props is really simple. You could think of it as like the API handlers that we've been working on, but inside your page. At the end of the day, that's kind of basically what it is. So you get access to the request and the response objects inside of here. You get access to all that stuff. You can do whatever you want that's valid on the server. And very much like get static props, you just need to return an object with props. That's it. And that's going to be passed into your component. The difference between this and get static props is that this function, get server-side props, is always executed per request. So when you hit this request, it's going to run this function. Whereas get static props only happens once at build time. Get server-side props happens every time on the request. So it's true server-side rendering. And so might be a better place to put something dynamic like a user ID, where you don't want to generate every single user ahead of time, which is ridiculous. And instead, you just want to render them when they're asked on the server. Or even better, just do it on the client using SWR or React Query and don't do anything on the server. Just render the JSX and do the data fetching on the client. So those would be better alternatives. But yeah, that's basically it. And like I said, you get access to the request and response objects, which we will be using in the next example. And yeah, it's really powerful. So I have this thing down here that kind of walks through when to use which mode. So I'm just going to walk through this right quick. So when to use what? Do you need data at runtime, but you don't need server-side rendering? Then use client-side data fetching. So pretty simple there. Do you need data at runtime, but you do need server-side rendering? Then use get server-side props. Do you have pages that rely on data that is cacheable and accessible at build time, like from a CMS? Then get static props. Do you have the same as above, but all the pages have dynamic URL parameters like /ID, then you need to do get static props and get static paths at the same time. And that's pretty much it when you want to do those things. Any questions on that?
Are there any issues with using get server-side props and get static props?
Yeah, I know I've talked about that some. Oh yeah, literally I talk about it right here. Okay, good eye. Yeah, I guess I can mention it right now. It's not recommended to use get server-side props unless you absolutely need it. Like if you just absolutely need server-side rendering, then use it. But if you don't do it. Just do client-side data, or find a way to get static props. Because even with get static props, you can still have a hybrid page, which you'll see in a minute. You can still render some stuff on the server and then do the rest on the client. You can opt in and opt out whenever you want. There's no either or. The only either or situation would be either you use get static props or you use get server side props. You can't use them both. You use either or one of these, and then static paths goes with static props. So yeah, I don't recommend using get server side props unless you absolutely have to. So in a condition where you would have to, where it would be like, I have these dynamic pages. The data is only, it's like, data that's always being updated. So I can't get it at build time because maybe it's like a Twitter feed or something like that. But I need it to be indexed as well. So it's dynamic data that always changes, but I also need it to be indexed. Then it's like, okay, maybe you need server-side rendering. You probably need server-side rendering. But I would say most of the time you don't need server-side rendering. If most of the time, if your data is really that dynamic, then you would just do client-side fetching and hope that the crawler kind of catches it. But I would guess some scenarios would be like, let's say I'm a car review website and we have tons of car reviews and we have ads and stuff everywhere. Well, yeah, you might need server-side rendering for that because maybe building all those pages are really expensive and takes too long. So server-side rendering is better. You want it to be indexed. You want it to show up on social media. You want those ads to populate. But at the same time, all that logic is computed, at runtime. So maybe server-side rendering is good for that. But yeah, most of the time, nah, probably not.
How would you think about authentication? Where would you put it?
So there's two types of authentication, right? We're talking authenticating APIs, and then we're talking about authenticating front-end routes. Authenticating front-end routes is very similar to what you would do now. In fact, I don't think I do anything different with Next.js when authenticating a front-end route than what I do currently right now. Right now, what I do is I use a hook to check to see if someone's authenticated. And any page that I want to be authenticated, the first thing I do is I use that hook to see if they're authenticated. And if they're not, I redirect them to a sign-in page. So you still can do that on the front end. If you've ever done I think a lot of people have used routers features on React to use front-end authentication. And that's why they might be asking the question, because there's no router configuration here. So where do I do that? I use a hook. I've always used a hook. I even did it with Create React App. I just put a hook in there that checks, wherever your JWT is, wherever your cookie is, whatever your authentication logic is. Even if you got to hit the server every time, I check there to see if you're authenticated, and I redirect it to a 404. And that's what I do for client side. And that's not specific to Next.js. For server side, if you're talking about authenticating one of these API routes that we have, then if you're using Next Connect, it's very similar to what you would normally do on Express. So you would say app.u or .use, and then you would just do your check auth middleware here, right? So if you have a check auth middleware, that looks something like this, const check auth, takes a request, takes a response, right? Takes a next, and then you would just say, if rec.headers authorization, right? You would check here, and then if they are, you call next. If they're not, you respond with a 401 or whatever you want to respond with. And that's how you lock down your API. So that's authentication as well. And then authentication inside of one of these functions. Well, these functions don't create resources. So there's no routes or anything in these functions. These functions call resources. So there really is no authentication here. But as far as get server-side props, you do get access to the request object, which does have access to the HTTP headers. So you could check the headers of this request from the browser on get server-side props. So if you want to target authentication there, you can also do that there and get server-side props. You can't do that and get static props because it's not a server. It's running at build time. It's not even in the browser yet. There's no concept of HTTP headers yet. So you won't even need it there. Now we get to the fun part, and we get to fetch some of our notes into our app and get it going. So the first thing we want to do is let's just seed our database because for the sake of brevity, we're actually only going to focus on pulling in the content. We're not going to create a UI right now to create some notes and update some notes and things like that. We're just going to just pull the notes down. So let's just seed our database with some notes. So you can head over to that data file, and I'm going to go there, and I'm just going to seed some notes like that. Little hack that I always do to fill an array with some stuff. So if you never used this before, new array, you put a number that's going to create n amount of entries in an array. You do a .fill. Whatever you put in fill is going to because right now if you just do new array, it'll be 15 undefined. It'll say undefined 15 times. Do a dot fill, that's going to change them all to 1. So now I have an array of 1 15 times. And then I'm going to map over that to change them all to an object, basically. So it's just like a quick way to fill an array with some stuff, something I've always said. I think there's a quicker way to do it, but this is how I always just do it. Cool. So yeah, we got the database seeded with some notes here. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what we need to do to get this data. So let's think about getting all the notes from the page. So how could we get this? Could we get it client side? Absolutely. We can do client side, but that's not specific to Next. We're doing Next.js here. We're not just going to fetch stuff client side like that without entertaining other ideas. So that means we really got get server side props, or we have get static props. So I decided to get server side props on getting all the notes. And that's because I really want you all to observe how that works at runtime for server-side rendering, so you can really understand what's happening. And so we're just going to do get server-side props. You could do get static props here, but the thing is, if this was a real application and we were actually taking notes and doing notes like that, I don't know how many notes you're going to have, and I don't want to fetch the whole database at build time and stick all the notes on there. Like, I don't want to do that. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But for this application, I don't. I don't think the data is fit for that. So I'm just going to get it every time when you request it. That's what I'm going to do. You got to make that decision, that business decision. But at the same time, Next has some really good techniques cooked inside of it that really help with a lot of stuff. Like even get server-side props and server-side render pages are cached. Even they are pre-rendered. So like it still works pretty well, even though they don't recommend doing it that well. And I don't recommend using get server-side props all the time. But even then, they kind of save you with some of that caching. So enough talk. Let's get some data. So I'm just going to copy that fetch right there. And then I'm going to go into our index right here. I'm going to export a function or an async function for get server side props like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch our data. So fetch, in this case, can't take a relative path. So you might be tempted to be like, well, I'm already on my API. I should just be able to do that. You'll get an error saying you can't take relative paths inside of fetch, right? It has to be a full path. And so then, I don't know if you've connected the dots yet. It's like, well, how would we, if we were to deploy this, then like, obviously this isn't gonna work. This is kind of gross. So how do we get the URL? I mean, there's a lot of ways to get the URL. You get the headers here. You could probably inspect it and get the URL if you want. Or you can be explicit and just use environment variables, right? So we have the next config, put an environment variable in there for your URLs for staging, production, localhost, and use them here. Pretty simple. So that's what I recommend, but we'll just hard code it for now. So we'll get fetch. If you've ever used fetch before, you have to call a JSON on it because this is literally window.fetch. So then we'll get the data here, and that'll be await res.json, like that. So we get the data, and then on the API, I always return a data property. So I'm just gonna destructure that so I don't have to say data.data, which is gross. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna log this note right quick, like that. And then I'm just going to return some props that has notes on it like that. So, because this should be all the notes. I'm doing a GET request to API/note, which is all the notes, right? So let's do that. And then we can see here, we need to, oh wait, I'm on the wrong page, sorry. I'm like, wait, this is the wrong page. Let me go to note index, here we go. Or notes index, here we go. Boom, so put that back in there. So now that we have the notes, you can see I already have these mocked out notes that I have on the client side. I was gonna erase that because I put those on the server side now. And then now I can use the props that I'm passing in, which is gonna be notes. I can use those right there, which are the same name. So I can do that. And this should work exactly the same. All right, so let's test it. Let's go back. Let's go here, go to notes. Looks like something messed. Oh yeah, I don't have any notes. I gotta restart this. Let's see. Okay, I'll see. Okay, looks like I'm still getting back a janky response here. Let's see. Did I do my notes data thing wrong? Notes. Don't look like it. Let's see. See what that looks like. Oh, that looks good to me. Oh, I still got the check auth stuff in there. Okay. I'm like, wait, that definitely works. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. Boom. There we go. So then we get some notes on the page, which looks very similar to what we already had before. So boom, got some notes. All that data is coming down. We can see the log here is logging on the server, right? So I'm logging those notes. They log on the server. Now we can check the actual client here. And you can notice they don't log on the client. That's because that code doesn't run on the client. It only runs on the server. And I really want to emphasize that point. This get server-side props only runs on the server. So if I can get to it again, there we go. There we go, yeah. This only runs on the server. So good to go there. The next thing we'll do is we'll fetch one note. So if we go look at that, you can see we're also going to use get server-side props for this. This one's going to be a little different. We want a little different experience here. So we're going to attempt to fetch a note, but if the note is not there, then we're going to redirect to /notes. Now that's powerful, right? We're literally fetching data server-side. We're going to attempt to get the data. If it comes back not okay, we're just going to redirect back to /notes. That's it. And we won't even finish rendering this page. I believe that's like a superpower that you can do. So we'll just do that. I'm just going to copy that thing. So what we'll do is we'll go to the ID page here and we'll say exports async function get server side props like that. I'm going to need the params here. I'm also going to need the request objects or the response objects, one of those. Which one? I think I need both. No, I just need the response. Yeah, I just need the response. I'll just get both. So we'll do that. And then I'm going to paste in this HTTP call. So one thing to notice, I'm getting the params here. And this is the thing about get server-side props. It's running at build time. So I do have the parameters in the URL, so I can refer to them here. Whereas if I try to use get static props here, there's no way I would have the parameters. So then I would have to use get static paths to get the parameters. And then I would have to make an API call to the database to get every single note ahead of time, get all their IDs, and then render a static page for every single one, which is what I think you should be doing for most of the things that you're doing. But in this case, my note is dynamic, it's always changing. I don't want to statically render my note. I want it to always be dynamic, so I'm not going to do that. But if this was a blog, if this was anything static, or something that maybe I can do hybrid on the front end, which I probably can with this note, then I wouldn't do get server-side props. In fact, I probably wouldn't. I would just fetch the note on the client, to be honest. I would just do it here because I don't need this page to be indexed by Google. So I wouldn't even do server-side props. I would just fetch it on the client, most likely. But for the sake of example, we're going to do get server-side props. All right, so we get the response, and then we can say if not response dot okay, which is something that fetch will tell you if it's a non-200, and then it's not okay, then I'm just going to say res dot right head, I believe. And I'm gonna put a 302, and then I'm going to put I want to say, is it like location? Let me see. Oh yeah, I was right. So follow my instincts. So location, and then I can put a relative path in here for notes. And then I'll just say res dot end this request, so end it. And just to comply with the API of get server-side props, I'll just return a props with an empty object. And then if we do get something back, then I do want to get this data. So then I'll say data equals await response.json, not J1. And then I'm just going to return some props here with the actual notes, which will be the data. All right, so we got that. And then up here, I just need to use that. So then I'll have my note, and I have, so now that this note is injected, I don't really need, to get the query anymore. I'm not doing anything client side, so I don't really need the router or the query here. I can just say notes dot title, like that. All right, so let's try that, see what happens. Might have to do a rebuild. Let's check it out. Okay, that was a prefetch, and then boom, there we go. So then we got note 2. If I go back, we got note 1, note 4. I don't know if you noticed that, but the first time I clicked on it, it took a minute. It waited. It was pre-rendering that page, because that was the first time that page ever got ran. So I had to pre-render it, and then every single call after that is instant. Right? It's pretty instant. So it just pre-rendered it, which, like I said, you still get that with server-side props. You still get that pre-rendering, which is really awesome, and that caching. Okay, cool. The last one we're going to do is we're going to do get static props on the home page. So let's head over to the home page here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say export function. We won't do anything async here. Export function get static props. And we're going to simulate getting data from a CMS. So, if you had a CMS here, get data from a CMS like that. And then instead we'll just act like we have it already. I'm gonna return some props, and then maybe I'll say some content, and then I'll say a title, which is, this is my really nice app, like that. Oh, come on. There we go. Right, so I'm returning a prop called content. That's an object that has a title. So now I can come up here and say, give me the content. And then I can replace this with content.title. Boom. So now if I go back to my home page, there we go. This is my really nice app. There's my content. This got statically rendered. It literally rendered instantly. I didn't even have to do a rebuild. It was stupid fast. We're going to get a little bit into more about what these things actually do other than fetching data. And yeah, it's going to get a little crazier, but yeah, you're pretty much there. Okay, cool. So if you didn't feel like keeping up, you can check out to this data fetching branch and everything will be there. So check it out if you want to.
Hey, Scott?
Yes.
Is data fetching and components very much different?
Good question. So data fetching and components. So if you wanted to fetch some data and components, the way you would do that is purely client side. You would have to do it client side. Just the same way you do it in React now. It's literally the same thing, because Next.js is splitting based off routes and pages. So those are the things that get server-side rendered. And then if those pages import components, then those components get rendered on the server too. But it all starts off with the entry to the page. So the page has to get rendered, and then the components follow. So because of that, you're not going to be exporting things there. Like I know in Gatsby, you can export like queries inside of components and stuff like that. No, you won't be doing that here. You'll just be fetching data on the client side. If you do need some data that's server-side rendered, that's like fetch that build time or server time inside of a component, I highly recommend, really the only way you can do it is you got to pass it down, right? So you either can use context, using React context, use some type of state management library that you want, or just pass them down as props. So I think that's the way to go. And that's actually kind of like how I've done it anyway. I don't really write React apps where I do data fetching inside of a component. It's rare that I would do it. It would have to be like I'm integrating with this third-party API that requires me to, like, for instance, Stripe sometimes I have to do it, or like Google Maps or something where I gotta like integrate and pull something down. Most of the time I do all my data fetching inside of pages anyway. And then I use whatever mechanism I want, whether it's a state management library, whether it's, like I said, context, or just passing them down to components. That's kind of how I do it. That way I can organize my loading and my UI strategy from one source. Because you start pulling in data in many different components, it's like, okay, well, how do you handle the loading state? How do you handle the error state? Then how do you handle all these other states? And it just gets all over the place. It's a lot easier just to do it in one place, in my opinion. So that's kind of how I do it. And it's really also makes your components a lot more flexible and presentational. So you can just use those components in any single app because all they take are props. They don't do any actual logic. So that's just something that I've been doing. Cool, rendering modes. So we're just gonna talk a little bit. Now that you know what those functions are, we're gonna talk a little bit about what they actually do. So Next.js actually looks at the data fetching in your page components. Yeah, it's not just looking because it's gonna call those functions. It's actually doing that to determine how it's gonna prepare your page. So, and because it has different rendering modes, or I should say different pre-rendering modes. So what is pre-rendering? Pre-rendering is like an umbrella term meant to say, we're gonna take this JavaScript, this React app, and we're going to render it before it goes to the browser. So what does that actually mean? We're gonna turn it into an HTML string before it goes to the browser. That's basically what it means. It's gonna do that. It's gonna turn it into an HTML string before the browser. It's not going to execute any interaction on it. Like if you got handlers and things like that, no, those won't happen. Those won't get affected. You can still do Windows stuff inside of those handlers and logic, but the actual presentation of it is going to be rendered on the server and is going to be turned into HTML. The CSS, the HTML, that's what's going to be sent down to the browser. And that's why server-side rendering and static rendering is so great, because it's instant, especially if you put that on the CDN and you cache it, people get to see your page immediately. But in the past, that's how we always build websites. But in the past, okay, cool, your website got here fast and it's great, but now it's not interactive. So then now you do something called rehydration, which is now you take the client side version of that app, which is pretty much an exact copy of the server side one, just not rendered yet, and with all the other logic, and you basically take over where the server side left off. So he's like, okay, cool, here's where you left off. Now I'm gonna go find the root component. Let's say it's the app the root div in the HTML document, and I'm gonna bootstrap this React app here. And I'm gonna take all these JSON files that have all the data that was called on the server, and I'm gonna pass them into all the pages that need them. And boom, now I'm in a client-side app. So you get the best of both worlds. You get that fast rendering from the server, but then you get that fast routing from client-side routing and that interactivity that you really get from single-page applications. So it's like the best of both worlds. So that's kind of the philosophy of like pre-rendering and where all that comes from. So different pre-rendering modes. You have static generation. Static generation is basically, I'm literally turning these pages, everything that they need, the data, like you could take this page, this HTML string, you could throw it on the browser and it will work and look exactly the way that I want it to. That's static generation. So again, great for things like docs, static pages, landing pages, blogs, anything where the content is like not that dynamic. It's basically, if you have content that's not being changed by a user, you should static generate it. If it's content being changed by a user, maybe rethink it. So any non-user generated content should be static generated, in my opinion. So anything made by you and your team, static generated. And basically the benefits of that is that it's CDN cacheable. It's just a string. So you can throw it in front of a CDN. It works. It doesn't need a server. It doesn't need Node. It's just a file that's served from a CDN and it's instant. So that's static generation. Then you have server-side rendering, which is basically, it will turn your React component into a string, just not at build time. It'll do it at runtime when you request that page. So if I do a GET request to /notes, that's gonna go to the node server. It's gonna render that component on the server first, get the HTML, send it back to the browser, and then boom, it's there. Any subsequent request is gonna be cached. It's gonna cache it. In this case, Next.js does cache it, but it's still gonna come from the server versus it being there ahead of time. So you can't cache these. This has to be computed at runtime. There's computation here. There's no, caching there. So the build times are faster, absolutely, because you're not pre-rendered during build, but the runtime cost might be bigger depending on how long your computation is to render this page. If you're doing like a huge database query, you're doing a map reduce, you're doing all this crazy stuff inside of a server-side props, function, yeah, it's going to be crazy. So you got to think about that. And then you got client-side rendering, which is what you're normally used to. You just send back an index.html that has nothing in it but some script tags, maybe a link tag, and like a div with an ID on it that says app. And then JavaScript comes in and bootstraps that. That's client-side rendering, right? And then the fourth one, which is not here, is like a combination of all of these things, right? So you can pick and choose how you want all these to work, and you can really build a truly hybrid application using Next.js because you can opt in and opt out. So those are all the different modes. So by default, all the pages are pre-rendered. Every page you make in the pages folder is pre-rendered by default. And that's what that little battery means. It's like, yeah, we pre-rendered this thing, it's good to go. And that's whether or not you ask for data or not, it's gonna be pre-rendered. So you get all that stuff for free. And now if you choose get static props, that's gonna do static generation. It's in the word, get static props. It's gonna statically render this page ahead of time. So it's cacheable, it can be on a CDN. If you do get server-side props, it's gonna server-side render. It too is also in the name, server-side props. So it's gonna render that stuff on the server. And then for client-side rendering, you can do server-side rendering and static generation, and then still also do client-side rendering because Next doesn't touch the logic inside your React component. That's React land, you're inside of React. Next.js has it doesn't care, it doesn't touch that stuff. So you can still make a query inside your React component and then render some components based off the result of that query. It still works. So that's how you can like hook into this page is server rendered, this page is statically generated, this page is purely client side, this page is a combination of static and client, this page is a combination of server and client. Like it gets really crazy. The way that you do it is depending on what function you export to fetch data. That's it. You export a certain function, you opt into that method. This is my favorite part of Next.js because as a developer who having built so many server-side apps in so many different languages, so many different frameworks, it's a pain doing it from scratch. So I really like the fact that they do this. And as a developer who has created server-side rendering technologies, I can appreciate the thought that they put into making this effortless and easy to think about. In my opinion, it's very simple. So very well done. So now we're just going to finish up with this last section and get into some really important topics about Next.js. And you'll be a certified Next.js developer if that's a thing. If it was, you would be one. So let's go in and talk about working with server-side rendering, because I think this is always a big topic. And I think a lot of people who aren't used to working with server-side rendering in general always have some of the same questions. Specifically, one of the biggest gotchas I always see people run into with server-side rendering is that either they created some component or they installed some component that's using browser-specific things, DOM APIs. And when they try to render it on the server, they get an error, right? Because it's like, oh, document not defined, oh, window not defined, like all this stuff. And it always just seems to, come back and bite them. And I was guilty. I fall into that trap a lot when I was doing server-side rendering in the early days. So I just kind of want to talk about that and how Next.js gives you some tools to help you with that so you don't have to do it yourself. Okay, so working with server-side rendering, like I said, sometimes you just really need to skip rendering some components sometimes for many different reasons. Here are a few. One, does that component have some DOM API, window, navigator, GPS? I don't know. It's using literally the DOM API to do something. The data that it needs only comes from the client side. Like it comes from some client side API call or something like that. And you're not handling the errors. You don't have any defaults. So either the data's there or it's not. So it'll just break on the server side if there's no data. And then for something else, I don't know, maybe you literally just don't want to render this thing on the server for whatever reason. You have your reasons. So if that's the case, Next.js gives us something that actually works very well for this. And it's not something that they created, they just supported it and extended it. And that's going to be called the dynamic imports. So if you've never seen or heard of dynamic imports, it's something new to the spec. You can get this in Webpack. You can get this, with a combination of Webpack, Babel, things like that. And I'm pretty sure it's coming to the browsers eventually. If it's not there already, I'm not keeping up with the browser spec, so I don't know. But basically, it allows you to do a dynamic import of a component. In this case, they're importing, or I'm importing an add component here. So the way that it works is you can pass an import statement, but this time it actually looks like a function, right? So you import like a function, and then you put a path. And whatever the default is for this module is going to be returned when this gets resolved. And then as an extension, you can do SSR false, which means don't server render this thing. So dynamic components basically just don't get rendered. They don't get built. They don't get bundled until they're accessed. So if you had this sponsored ad and you put it here like I did, this won't get injected and bundled, right? Basically, this component is going to be built by its own. It's going to have its own file. Instead of being bundled in with all the other components, it's going to be treated like its own file, kind of like a route would, like a page. A page has its own file, and that's kind of how they're their own apps. By doing this dynamic import, you're basically making this component its own file, and you're dynamically importing it when you need it. And if you know how JSX works, whenever you render a JSX component like this, what this boils down to is you actually calling a function. You're actually invoking this function, and any prop that you pass on to it are going to be parameters to that function. So if this compiled down to JavaScript, you're actually calling 1, 2, 3, 4. You're calling 4 functions here. So when this function gets called, then it renders that component. It's dynamic in that case, and then that's where it gets fetched. So you might see like if you go open the network tab, you might actually see this component being fetched when it gets rendered, because that's when it was used and that's when it was called. So that's a dynamic import. And by putting SSR false, we can skip out on having something being rendered on the server. So for instance, if we have, a component like, let's just make something right quick inside of the index, or actually I'll go to components and I'll make a new file here and I'll call it, a browser.tsx. So we'll have something here. We'll import React from React like that. And we'll say export default, and we'll put a component in here. And we'll just, I'll just put something simple. Browser component like that, right? So we got a browser component, but then maybe let's say we did some window dot thing up here, right? We did some window stuff on here. So what's something that I can do in the window right quick? Actually, I'll just log the window. Let me just console.log, or even better, document.query, or document.body. There we go. That's a good one. So we can do that. Let's log the document.body. And then if I were to import this into a page, which is rendered on a server. So let me go to a page. Let's go to the index page here. I can say imports the browser component from source components browser like that, right? And I'm just going to import that file. And if Next.js doesn't polyfill document, which they probably do, they might just polyfill it and just null it, so it might still work. But if they don't, this would break. So yeah, it looks like they might polyfill it. Let's see. Yeah, so I think we're good there. But if I did something like super browser related in here, I can't think of a good example right now without making a complicated component. But anyway, if I wanted to skip this from being rendered on the server for whatever reason, then what I could do is just go into that index page. And instead of importing the browser like that, I could say imports dynamic from Next dynamic. And then what I can do is say browser components equals dynamic like that. And then that takes a function which returns a promise, and the imports function does return a promise. So I can say source components Oh, Brower. Should be browser. Okay. So I can do that. And then I could render that component, right? So I could say, oh, wait, let me add a SSR false. There we go. And then I can add the browser component. Brower component. And then boom, it shows up here. Everything's good to go, but it didn't render on the server. And the way that you could check that out is if you were to inspect the output, right? The actual HTML. So, oops. So if I go here, and it's probably gonna look like mush. I don't know why I'm looking at it. But if I go to doc, or actually, I think you could just look at the source. Yeah, that might be better. Okay, yeah, it was not showing up there. But if I look for, this is my really nice app, I'm pretty sure that will show up. There we go. So this is my really nice app. But what you won't see is browser component. Right? That's not there because that didn't get rendered on the server. So it's not there. It's injected at execution time. So that's how you can skip server-side rendering, which is a really good thing, specifically working with third-party libraries that use browser-specific stuff inside of something like Next.js.
Can you put a fallback UI like React Lazy works? Right, like while the dynamic component is loading client side?
Yeah, you can put a fallback UI inside of here. I want to say that it takes a fallback prop here. Actually, I've never used it, so I guess we can find out together right now. I don't want to give you the wrong information, so let's see, Next.js, dynamic component, if I can spell. Or loading. There we go, custom loading. Yeah, so it's loading. You put loading and then you can put a component.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. All right, let's talk about deployment. So depending on how you build your app will determine where you can deploy to. So we talked about the different rendering modes and stuff like that, but we didn't really talk about like the different ways to build a Next.js app. So by default, a Next.js app has to be deployed to an environment that supports Node.js. I did talk about that, and that's because this is a full stack framework that uses, as you've learned, server-side rendering, APIs, all different types of stuff. So you need a Node.js environment because it is a live server that's actually running. So yeah, you will need that. Even if you don't make any API routes, you still will need a Node.js app or a Node.js environment by default. So if you don't want that, you can build your app in a different way. And that is something new. It's called Next Export. Basically what that does is it's going to export your Next.js app as purely static. It's literally going to build it static, no server, no runtime, deploy it straight to the CDN, deploy it wherever you want, Netlify, Vercel, anywhere you can deploy it. But there are some gotchas with using the export that you can check out here. And I'm not really going to, there's just a lot of gotchas. So you can check them out there. But honestly, at the end of the day, if you just go with Vercel, the people who made Next.js to deploy your site, they pretty much handle everything. I mean, if anyone knows how to handle a Next.js app, it's definitely the people who made it. And it just so happens they also made a deployment platform. So it kind of just works. And I'm pretty sure they use AWS as their infrastructure. So it's on AWS anyway, which is pretty good. So yeah, I would just use Vercel to deploy your stuff. And with that being said, like I said, if you need to deploy to a Node.js environment, that's going to rule out certain places. So I know Netlify is a popular one for a lot of people. You can't use Netlify by default with a Next.js app. There's like plugins and hacks and different things you can do. But the only way I've been able to see it work is if you find some way to get Next.js You got to make like a custom server with Next.js, which you can. We didn't talk about that, but you can make your own custom server, your entire custom server, instead of the one that they use. And then hook that up to Netlify's serverless functions and have the service functions act as the Next.js's server. And it's just, to me, it's just a lot of work. It's like, why would you do that? So it's really not worth it. I mean, I guess if you work at a company that only ever uses a certain technology and you had to use it, then yeah, but I would just use a different technology. I would either change the provider or I would change the framework. I wouldn't really do all of that. So yeah, I would just use Versal. It handles everything out of the gate. One thing though in our app is, yeah, we did hard code those API URLs. So before you deploy, use the environment variables to switch out to the live URLs. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to work, right? It's going to say like localhost or, you know, stuff like that. So we're going to deploy to Versal. And like I said, it's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is install the command line and then run this command. That's it. You don't have to do anything else. And then you're done. It's really that easy. If you've ever heard of a tool called Now a couple of years ago, these are the creators of Now. And Now is a CLI that basically deployed your website right now. It was that easy. I think that's kind of where they started. And then, you know, they integrated to Zeit and now they're Versal. But that same philosophy of like getting something out there as fast as possible is still there with inside of Versal. So yeah, I highly recommend doing that. So I think that's what we're going to do. The other way to do it is if you already have a project on GitHub, if you already pushed this up, it's on GitHub, you can just go into your Versal account and you can just say, connect to this repo. And then it also just works that way as well. And that'll give you a better development workflow because you'll get like preview branches on every PR. It'll post screenshots to your PR for you by default to show you the diffs between pages that changed, visual diffs, which is really dope. There's just a lot of stuff you can do there that you get for free. So yeah, highly recommend the GitHub workflow. In order to get this deployed, we got to do a couple things. I'm actually just going to stash all of this. Let me see. I'm going to check out to one of the branches that I know is solid, so I'm not fixing some of my bugs. We're going to check out to master. I don't want this. Okay. What we got? Okay. Oh, I got all these extra files, huh? Okay, so check out the master. And then what I need to do is, go away. I need to change those hard-coded fetch calls, right? So what I'll do is I'll add some environment variables. So instead of having things here, I don't know what this URL is going to be. So I have to add an environment variable. So I'll go down to our next config here and make it take some environment variables. So what I'll do is I'll add some environment variables here and I'll call it API URL. And then for localhost, it's localhost. Boom. So we got the API URL. And then what I can do is I can head back into these things or these things right here, and I could just use the URL instead. So I'll just do this. Process.env.api URL like that. And do the same thing on the ID one. Boom. So we got the API URLs there. We'll just need to make sure we set these environment variables on Versal when we deploy. So all that's good. Looks really good here. I'm just gonna make sure I have Versal on my machine on this version of Node. Looks like I do. You can do VC for short. You can also just type in Versal. I'm just gonna type in VC. So let me commit these changes. All right, I'm gonna type in VC. Got an update here and it's saying, cool, do you want to set up and deploy this thing? Yeah, I do. And I could pick which organization I want to deploy to. I'm going to deploy to my personal organization, a link to an existing project. I don't have any existing projects on Versal for this app, so I'm going to say no. What's your project's name? Next.js course app. In which directory is your code located? Right at the source. So I'm just going to say that's setting up projects. And you can see right there, auto-detected project settings. This is a Next.js app. Cool. And it's just like, we got these commands here that say, for a Next.js app, we think you should run npm run builds or next build. It's the same stuff that I already have. And they're saying, hey, can we overwrite it? And I was like, sure, I don't care. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just going to override it. You can just say no, and it'll totally work the same way. Which settings would you like to override? I guess they're all the same. I'll just put build command, sure. So right now it's building. They pretty much upload your thing and they have like their own CI where they build it in their CI. And you can look at this link and you can go inspect it to see how it's building. All right, so you can check it out right here in like their CI. And you can see, if this thing doesn't break, we'll see what happens. Usually the first time you deploy something, it never builds. So looks like it built. And you can see right here, it's like, oh yeah, SSG, static site generation. So it did some static stuff right here. It even tells you to build like, yep, yeah, we did some stuff right here. All right. And then
does
boom.
it automatically recognize your variables?
No, no, it's not. It doesn't have the values, but I'm going to add them in here. But we can see right here for this page, look, it loaded up. There we go. Next course app.versal.app. Easy. I think if I go to the next page, it might break. Let's see. Yeah, that's going to break, right? Because I don't have the variables in there. So I need to go add the variables in Versal. But this one didn't use any variables, so it was totally fine. It rendered fine, but the other ones didn't. So I got to go add the variables in there, and forgot how to do that in Next somewhere. I think it's like, where do you do that? Oh, here we go. Yeah, so it's breaking because it's trying to, still trying to get localhost, right? So yeah, it still failed because I don't have the right variables in there. So I need to just update the variables, which again, I think you do that here in settings. You go to environment variables, bam, and you can add them here. So if we do API, URL, and then maybe if I get the URL of my API, which is this thing, put that there. Maybe do the same thing. Like that, and preview, why not? No, the preview is gonna have a different URL, so, and so does development. This one's the only one we want. So I think that will fix it. I think now you gotta do like a redeployment. Pretty sure I gotta redeploy this thing. Yeah, you gotta redeploy it. Well, I'm on the wrong thing. Where'd it go? Yeah, I got to redeploy this thing. So I guess I'll just redeploy it. Why not? But yeah, that's pretty much Versal. Very simple to get started. Very easy. As is everything else. Everything else is pretty simple too. But I think Versal does the best job when it comes to deploying their own stuff. So yeah, highly recommend it. Any questions on any of this stuff?
I do have one quick question, and it's totally possible you mentioned this and I just missed it. But in terms of the server of Next.js, is that built on top of a Node environment? Where are the distinctions there?
Yeah, so the server, are we talking about the server for like your API, or are we talking about the server that like renders your pages?
I'm talking about the server for your API.
Yeah, that's Node. That's all Node. Next only uses JavaScript for everything. That is heavily based off of something called Connect. So if you look up Connect.js, you'll see this thing right here. That looks very similar to what we were doing with the .use and the stuff like that. .use. And just to even take it a step further, Express.js is what kind of made Connect popular. It's heavily, Next.js's API functions are heavily built off of Express. So if you look at Express and you did a .get, let's see. Yeah, it looks, well, here we go. It looks very much like this, right? So you could do .get. The only difference is we don't put paths on the Next.js ones because the paths are determined by the file name. So we won't put a path here. So we'll just put a controller that takes a request and response. So it's very similar to Express. And that's why we're able to use the same middlewares that Express can use, because it's all based off of Connect. So we can make our own middleware like this, or we can use installed middleware that we get from npm. Any other questions?
Have you used MDX with this at all, or tried to integrate those two, or just I'm sure there's like plugin for everything or package to use it.
Yep.
But,
yeah.
I was wondering if you had any experience with that.
Yeah. So you can use MDX with Next. There's an official supported plugin that the Next team creates. With MDX, it uses remark, just the same typical stuff you would normally have. And basically, you can just make .mdx or .md files, and it works the same way that you would expect, right? You would just make an MDX file, and it's going to create a page out of that. So yeah, it totally works just fine. I think that's kind of like alluding to the thing that I really wanted to talk about, which is like Jamstack stuff. So I'll talk a little more about the Jamstack stuff too. There really isn't like a lot of code to show you. It's more just like a philosophy in the direction that Next is going. So I'll get there, but yeah, you can use the MDX plugin. But any other questions?
Have you deployed a large app, like a news site, like a large static website? And are there any pros and cons for using it?
I have deployed well over like 10 websites that all each have at minimal hundreds of thousands of pages. And I've done that probably the last couple of years in all different technologies, some with Angular, some with React, even some with using Vue. I've done 2 with Next.js, and that Next.js was the most pleasant experience out of the box. We found ourselves not wrangling with the framework itself, whereas with other frameworks, a lot of the effort went into getting the framework to do the job, whereas Next.js kind of did it out of the box. I would say some of the biggest, I wouldn't even say issues that we had with Next.js when deploying these huge sites was just figuring out the right strategy of like build time. It's just like, okay, how do we want to build these things? Do we want to wait for them? Do we want to optimize this build? And then how can we optimize that build? And I think that's something you're never going to get right, because there's always trade-offs. I mean, when things get big, time goes up. That's just how it is. But Next.js is working on something that will help with this, and it's called incremental builds. They didn't have this when I was building out these things, but they do have it now. So it's in beta. So the incremental builds are ridiculous. Basically, you can update your get static props or your get static paths and your get static props to basically use this. It's something called stel while revalidate. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this before, but this is also what their SWR hook client fetching library is based off on. So I highly recommend looking up what stel while revalidate is. But basically what it does is if new content comes in, it will go get that new content and regenerate the page for the content without having to get all the content ahead of time. So that way you don't have to do a build and do every single page at build time, you can just say, I only want to do a little bit, and then I want to get the rest later. It's very much similar to the fallback option on get static paths, but it's doing it. It's based the difference between the two. I think they talk about it here. Fallback option true. Yeah, so then fallback option true allows you to add new pages at runtime. But I think the difference here is that you can update the content after you've already like built the site. So the site can already have been built, and then they will go fetch the new pages. Whereas I think the fallback one has to be rebuilt. So it's a little different. It's super amazing. It's in beta. We're actually using it right now as an integration with our technologies. So and then Guillermo, the CEO of Next.js, is a good friend of mine, tweeted a demonstration of how they were able to basically show Next.js scale to 500 million pages a day. So infinitely. So if you have a website that's more than 500 million pages, then maybe you might have a problem, but he was able to do it for 500 million pages and it works just fine. So I think you'll be fine.
So since you've been fanboying or extolling the virtues of Next.js this entire time, are there any downsides or drawbacks or areas that you think that Next can improve on?
Yes. And I think this is where it comes to Jamstack. I do think Next.js needs to improve with their Jamstack. And they know that too. I mean, that's kind of where these features are coming from. So like when I think of Jamstack, I think of content being up to date all the time. And obviously incremental static regeneration helps with that. But also for like a developer experience, like just being able to edit content and see it change in real time would be really cool. You know, to take an example, like for instance, Gatsby. If you have a really good Gatsby source plugin that they, say, hey, this is a certified plugin, especially with a CMS, you can be sure that when that data changes on that CMS, it's going to change right there on your Gatsby site. Like it's going to happen immediately. You don't get that with other static site generators like Next.js or almost anyone. You just don't get that. And Gatsby's kind of like the first one that does that. So out of the box, you don't really get that with Next either. Can you make it work? Absolutely. Next.js also has preview. So they have preview mode, which kind of helps with this too. And you can set up a preview mode where content is in a draft state and you can preview that content. But still, there's just a little more work that has to be done. And I think they're getting there, but the experience isn't there yet. But needless to say, even though they're getting better at it and it's really good, I actually prefer what Next.js is doing anyway, because to me, the overhead of having to understand GraphQL and stuff can be quite difficult for someone who's already tasked with doing something like a static site generator today and integrating with a headless CMS. Like now you got to learn GraphQL. It can be overwhelming if you don't know it or care to know it. And then if the whole team is invested, now the whole team has to know GraphQL. So it's kind of a big investment to get into something like that, whereas Next.js is just JavaScript. And at the end of the day, I think Next.js's approach, and even just Versal's approach in general, is just like, hey, we're going to do one job and we're going to do it well. And then we're kind of just going to rely on the community to help us, come together and make this product better, right? Like Next.js and Versal is positioned well to work on a CMS, right? Like their whole product could use a CMS, but instead of making one, they're just partnering with every other CMS out there. Same thing with Gatsby, right? They're partnering with CMSs and stuff out there as well, because that's how they're positioned. But Next.js is like, well, if you guys want to do some Jamstack stuff, there's some really cool stuff out there. So one of them is called SourceBit. So SourceBit's really cool. And it's an open source project made by a company called StackBit. StackBit. Right, so StackBit is actually really dope. So SourceBit, what it does is it basically takes that thing that Gatsby does where it like allows you to update your website in real time when content changes without a refresh, without anything. It does that and adds it to any static site generator, basically. You can add it to anything, including Next.js. And basically it sits in the middle between like a CMS and your framework. And it makes sure that, the CSS has some incoming data. It'll update your framework with a WebSocket and you'll get the new data instantly. So you get a really nice developing experience. The CEO of this company has a nice video talking about it. But yeah, so you can use this with Next.js, which is what we're going to be recommending people use and what we will probably use until, or if Next.js even supports something like this, which honestly, I don't know if they should, because the community is very capable of doing it themselves. And it takes the heat from having Next.js to do everything themselves, which, you know, just do one job, do it well. So yeah, check that out. And then StackBit, which basically you want to launch a Jamstack website with a, you know, on-site editor to edit content on the page, but also connect to any CMS that you want. It's StackBit. You can literally click in here and like, I want to start with this site. You click here, you pick a static site generator that you want. You pick one, you continue, you pick a CMS that you want. So boom, and then you connect it and then it just deploys it for you and you're ready to go. Like you don't have to do anything. So different stuff like that. But yeah, I would say that's probably a downside with Next. If it is a downside, is that they don't have that experience yet. It's kind of disconnected, but it's coming together with actions by them and actions by the community. So yeah, and other downsides I would say, I think by default, the fact that you have to deploy to a node environment might confuse some people because they come to Next.js, think it's like just a static site generator like Gatsby, and then having to like, oh, we got to deploy this to like some node thing. I think that kind of confuses people. So, but I mean, they do a good job of documenting and clearing it up as well if you just follow along. So I would say that is a thing. I've often run into that with people thinking that it's a static site and it's not a static site generator and it's not just that. Other than that, no. I mean, I think they're doing a really good job. They're working with the Chrome team to add in like support built right into Chrome to make Next.js even better. So literally the team at Google is working with the team at Next.js to make Next.js like the framework for Chrome almost. And they're doing some really interesting stuff there, especially around React suspense and stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff is coming soon to Next.js and Google Chrome. So yeah, I think they're doing a really, really good job.
When is the advanced Next.js course coming?
You guys gotta, Mark has to answer that for you. I don't know. If you guys keep asking for it, it'll come. I love Next.js. I think that the conventions and opinions they put in the framework make it a pleasant, just a pleasant framework to work with. And I think at this point, you know enough to be able to build an application because, like I said, the application side of Next.js is just React, which is why we didn't cover a lot of that because there's nothing new there. It's just React. I just wanted to focus on the Next.js specific stuff, which is like everything that's around React and around data fetching and things like that. So we breezed over a lot of that stuff because it is just React, and even Front-End Masters has tons of courses on that. So I kind of just breezed past it. But at this point, yeah, you do know about 80% of what it takes to build a Next.js app. Everything else is like very advanced or authoring integrations and plugins and stuff like that. But as far as building an app, you pretty much got it. And if it feels like, oh, that was pretty easy, that's because it was meant to be easy. They did a really good job with the framework. It should be pretty easy. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys on Next.js.